Welcome back to Forbidden Lore. Tonight, leave behind the stories of fearless raiders, towering longships, and glorious battles. Instead, step into a world few dared to speak about, even 1,000 years ago. Hidden beneath the endless forests of the north, beyond frozen mountains and silent fjords, the Vikings guarded rituals that outsiders were never meant to witness. Ceremonies whispered to awaken forgotten gods. Sacrifices offered beneath blood-red moons. Graves prepared not only for the dead, but for those who would continue serving them beyond the veil. Some of these rites were recorded by travelers who watched in horror. Others survived only as fragments of old sagas, carved into weathered stones and passed from one generation to the next. And somewhere between history and legend lies a darker story, one that has never completely disappeared. Tonight, we will follow the fading echoes of those forgotten ceremonies, traveling deep into the spiritual world of the Vikings, where every raven might carry a message, every forest could hide an ancient shrine, and every shadow seemed to belong to something watching from another realm. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the cold winds of the north carry you back more than 1,000 years. This is the dark rituals of the Vikings. Long before the Viking longships appeared on distant horizons, before their dragon-headed prows struck fear into the kingdoms of Europe, there existed another world hidden beneath the same northern sky. It was a world that few outsiders ever witnessed, and even fewer truly understood. Behind every raid, every kingdom, and every legendary warrior stood an ancient spiritual landscape shaped by ice, darkness, and an unshakable belief that unseen powers walked beside the living. To understand the Vikings, one must first forget the familiar image of roaring warriors charging into battle. That image, though rooted in history, tells only part of their story. Their greatest fears did not always come from enemies carrying swords. Many believed the forests were listening. They believed the sea possessed its own memory. They believed the wind could carry voices that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead. The world they inhabited was beautiful beyond description, yet endlessly unforgiving. Towering mountains rose above narrow fjords where cold waters reflected skies that seemed to stretch forever. Dense forests covered the valleys, their ancient trees standing long before the first Viking settlement, and surviving long after entire generations had disappeared. During winter, daylight often lasted only a few precious hours before darkness returned to claim the land once more. Snow buried villages. Rivers froze into silent roads of ice. The stars shone with a clarity almost impossible to imagine today. For those who lived there, nature was never merely a collection of mountains, rivers, and trees. Every landscape possessed a spirit. Every storm carried intention. Every unexpected silence demanded respect. Modern people often separate religion from everyday life. The Vikings never made such a distinction. Their beliefs shaped every decision they made, from planting crops to choosing the day they would sail across dangerous seas. A newborn child, a successful hunt, an unexpected illness, even the cry of a raven flying overhead, could all be interpreted as messages from powers far older than humanity itself. The gods were never distant figures, living only in stories. They were thought to move through the world continuously. Odin wandered the earth disguised as an old traveler, searching for forgotten wisdom. Thor protected both farmers and warriors from monstrous forces that threatened the fragile order of existence. Freya received not only prayers for love and prosperity, but also half of those who died bravely in battle. Even Loki, whose name would later become synonymous with deception, occupied a place far more complicated than simple evil. Above them all stretched Yggdrasil, the immense world tree that held together every realm in existence. Its roots reached into places no living person could ever fully understand. Its branches extended beyond the heavens. Every creature, every god, every giant, every spirit, and every human existed somewhere upon its endless form. According to Old Norse tradition, the universe itself was not a single world, but 9 interconnected realms, bound together by Yggdrasil. Some belonged to gods. Some belonged to giants. Some were home to elves or dwarfs. One belonged to humanity. Another belonged to those who had already died. Travel between these realms was neither easy nor common, yet it was never considered impossible. The boundaries separating them were thin, especially during certain nights, especially in certain places, especially when ancient rituals were performed correctly. This belief changed everything. Death itself became something remarkably different from how many later civilizations would imagine it. For the Vikings, death was rarely viewed as an ending. It was a journey, a crossing, a transformation. The destination depended not simply upon how a person died, but also upon how they had lived, which gods favored them, and perhaps most importantly, whether the proper rites had been observed by those left behind. A warrior who fell courageously in battle might awaken in Valhalla beneath Odin's watchful eye, preparing endlessly for the final conflict that destiny promised would one day consume gods and men alike. Others might enter the great hall of Freya. Many ordinary people would travel instead to the realm ruled by Hell, a place far more complex than later ideas of eternal punishment. Hell was neither endless paradise nor constant torment. It simply existed as another destination within an endless cycle that no one could completely escape. Yet beneath these familiar beliefs lay something much older, something darker. Long before kings built great halls or warriors gained fame across distant kingdoms, forgotten generations had already developed rituals whose true purposes gradually disappeared into myth. The oldest sacred places were rarely magnificent temples. Instead, they were hidden within nature itself. A circle of stones overlooking a frozen valley, an isolated cave where sunlight entered only once each year, a grove of ancient pine trees where no axe was permitted to strike, a quiet lake whose surface reflected the moon with unnatural clarity. To outsiders, such places appeared empty. To those who knew their stories, they remained occupied at all times. Not by people, but by presences, invisible guardians, restless ancestors, spirits whose names had long since been forgotten. Many generations later, Christian monks who traveled through Scandinavia struggled to understand these customs. Some described them as devil worship. Others believed the northern people had simply lost their way. But those explanations reflected the fears of the visitors far more than the beliefs of the people they encountered. The Vikings themselves rarely imagined their rituals as acts of darkness. They believed they were preserving balance, maintaining ancient agreements between humanity and the unseen world. Every offering carried purpose. Every spoken word followed tradition. Every gesture repeated movements taught across countless generations. Some ceremonies welcomed prosperity. Others sought protection. Some asked for victory before battle. Others attempted to prevent famine, disease, or brutal winters from destroying entire communities. Yet not every ritual was intended to bless. There existed ceremonies performed only under strict conditions, rites that demanded silence, gatherings where only a chosen few could attend, practices that even neighboring villages sometimes refused to discuss openly. Children learned early that certain questions should never be asked. Certain paths through the forest should never be followed after sunset. Certain names should never be spoken aloud once darkness covered the land. Whether these warnings arose from genuine belief or practical caution is impossible to know. History rarely preserves certainty. Instead, it leaves behind fragments. A broken carving buried beneath centuries of soil. A sentence copied by a frightened traveler. A weathered saga written hundreds of years after the events it claimed to describe. Like scattered pieces of a shattered mirror, each fragment reflects only part of a much larger picture. Archaeologists continue to uncover objects that challenge old assumptions about Viking spirituality. Tiny carved figures buried beneath house foundations. Animal bones carefully arranged inside ceremonial pits. Weapons bent beyond use before being placed into lakes. Necklaces deposited deep within peat bogs where no one would ever wear them again. These discoveries reveal something striking. The Vikings often destroyed valuable possessions deliberately before offering them to unseen powers. To modern eyes, such behavior appears wasteful. To them, destruction transformed ordinary objects into sacred gifts. A sword that could no longer serve a living warrior might continue serving its owner beyond death. A broken spear might become whole once it crossed into another realm. Fire, water, and earth all possessed the power to carry offerings where human hands could no longer reach. No sacrifice was considered truly lost, only transferred. Over time, these beliefs became intertwined with countless local traditions. Every fjord possessed its own stories. Every isolated valley remembered different spirits. One village might honor a rocky hill where strange lights occasionally appeared during winter nights. Another feared a stretch of shoreline where fishermen claimed voices emerged from thick sea fog before dawn. Old women remembered songs their grandmothers had whispered. Hunters carried charms carved from antler. Sailors refused to leave harbor unless certain birds flew in favorable directions. No single authority controlled these beliefs. They spread naturally, changing with every generation, while preserving something unmistakably ancient beneath the surface. Among all these customs, however, there remained one tradition, spoken of with particular caution. It concerned individuals who claimed they could cross the invisible boundary separating ordinary people from the hidden world. Not after death, not in dreams alone, but while still drawing breath. They were said to hear voices carried upon the wind, to recognize omens hidden inside ordinary events, to see figures standing at the edge of moonlit forests, where everyone else saw only empty shadows. Some believed they protected entire communities. Others feared they possessed knowledge no human mind should ever contain. When they arrived, even the proudest warriors lowered their voices. Kings offered them seats beside the fire. Children were told never to stare directly into their eyes. Their names have survived only in scattered records and fading legends. The Old Norse world called many of them Völur, the keepers of forgotten wisdom, the weavers of fate, the women who walked where ordinary souls dared not follow. And according to some of the oldest stories ever whispered beneath the northern sky, their most powerful rituals did not begin beneath the light of day. They began only after the last raven had fallen silent, when darkness settled across the forests, and even the gods were said to listen. The village would often know they were coming long before anyone caught sight of them. No horn announced their arrival. No procession accompanied their steps. Instead, word traveled quietly from farm to farm, carried by shepherds, fishermen, and wandering traders, who claimed to have crossed paths with a lone traveler, wrapped in layers of dark wool, walking with remarkable patience despite the bitter cold. The visitor was almost always a woman. Age seemed impossible to measure. Some appeared no older than 40, while others carried faces so deeply lined that they resembled weathered bark from the oldest pine trees. Their hair, whether silver, black, or the pale color of northern flax, was usually hidden beneath elaborate hoods decorated with feathers, animal fur, or tiny bronze ornaments that chimed softly whenever the wind stirred. Most striking of all was the staff. Nearly every description left behind by later chroniclers speaks of a long staff carried by these mysterious women. Some were carved from ashwood, a tree already considered sacred because of its connection to Yggdrasil. Others were tipped with bronze, iron, or carefully shaped bone, many curved at one end like the neck of a bird. To modern archaeologists, these objects are among the strongest clues that the legends surrounding the Völur were rooted in reality. Similar staffs have been recovered from richly furnished graves across Scandinavia, buried beside women whose identities have long since vanished beneath the weight of centuries. To those who watched them arrive, however, the staff was more than a symbol. It was a key. It marked its bearer as someone who walked between worlds. The Vikings believed that knowledge demanded sacrifice. Odin himself had surrendered one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom. He had hung upon the branches of Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear. before discovering the secrets of the runes. If even the Allfather had suffered for knowledge, then those who sought lesser mysteries could expect no easier path. The Völur were thought to pay that price throughout their lives. Some traditions claimed they lived apart from ordinary society for many years before returning with gifts no one could explain. Others whispered that they spent entire winters alone among the mountains, speaking only to ravens and wolves, until human language itself began to sound unfamiliar. Whether these tales were true mattered less than the belief they inspired. People feared them. People respected them. Often, those two emotions were impossible to separate. When a vulva entered a settlement, preparations began immediately. The largest hall would be cleared. Fresh straw covered the floor. The central fire was fed until flames danced high enough to cast moving shadows across the wooden walls. Special food was prepared, not merely as hospitality, but as part of the ceremony itself. Milk from the healthiest cattle. Bread baked that very morning. Fish caught before sunrise. Sometimes the liver of an animal recently sacrificed. Nothing stale was permitted. Everything had to represent life at its fullest. Not because the visitor demanded luxury, because the unseen guests who might accompany her were believed to deserve respect. Outside, the ordinary rhythm of village life slowed. Children were called indoors. Dogs were kept close. Even the animals seemed strangely quiet. Many later storytellers claimed this silence proved supernatural forces had already gathered around the hall. Perhaps it was only imagination. Perhaps every person simply listened more carefully when they expected something extraordinary to happen. Either way, silence became part of the ritual. Inside the hall, those invited took their places carefully. The village leader, respected elders, experienced warriors, women known for their wisdom. Occasionally, a young person believed to possess unusual dreams. No one else entered. Those left outside waited through the long northern night, watching smoke rise from the roof while wondering what words were being spoken beyond the heavy wooden doors. The ceremonies themselves varied from place to place. No single version survived unchanged across the Viking world. Yet certain details appear again and again in surviving accounts. The fire remained at the center. The staff rested nearby. A raised platform covered with animal skins often served as the place where the vulva sat. Around her, those present formed a circle, not to imprison whatever powers might arrive, but to remind themselves that every life moved in circles. The changing seasons, the endless turning of the stars, birth, death, and birth once more. Songs began softly, not songs of celebration, not songs sung during feasts, not songs sung during feasts. These melodies followed older patterns, slow, repetitive, almost hypnotic. Each voice blended into the next until individual singers disappeared within a single continuous sound. Later Icelandic writings would refer to these ritual chants as sacred songs performed to strengthen the vision of the seer. Whether the music truly opened a doorway into another realm or merely altered the minds of those who listened remains impossible to answer. What is certain is that music held extraordinary importance in Norse ritual life. The voice itself was believed to possess power. Words spoken correctly could shape reality. Names carried strength. Promises carried weight. A curse uttered before witnesses might haunt an entire family for generations. The vulva listened before she spoke, sometimes for several minutes, sometimes much longer. Those watching described her breathing becoming slower, her head lowering, her eyes fixed upon nothing anyone else could see. Then came the questions, not from her, from the villagers. Would the coming winter be harsh? Would the harvest survive? Should warriors sail across the sea this year? Would an illness spare the children? Had the dead found peace? No question was considered too small if it concerned the uncertain future. The answers rarely arrived in simple language. Instead, they emerged as images. A black wolf crossing a frozen river. an eagle refusing fresh meat, a tree struck by lightning while remaining alive, a child holding fire without being burned. Each vision required interpretation. Each carried more than one possible meaning. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the Völur retained their influence for so many generations. Their words invited reflection rather than certainty. People remembered them. They argued over them. Often, they discovered meaning only years later, after events had already unfolded. History offers many examples of leaders seeking certainty before making dangerous decisions. The Vikings were no different. A chieftain preparing to launch an expedition might consult a völva before risking dozens of lives at sea. A family considering marriage between powerful clans might ask whether the union pleased the gods. Even kings are said to have sought such counsel. The future, after all, belonged to no one. Everyone feared what waited beyond tomorrow. Yet alongside these respected ceremonies grew darker whispers. Not every gathering sought guidance. Some pursued power. Old legends speak of nights when the songs changed. Their gentle rhythm disappeared. The circle around the fire tightened. The flames themselves were fed with herbs, whose smoke drifted strangely through the hall, filling the air with scents unfamiliar even to those raised among forests their entire lives. People claimed the smoke bent against the wind, that sparks rose downward before vanishing, that shadows stretched across walls where no firelight reached. No surviving source proves such events occurred. Neither can history completely dismiss them, for belief has always possessed its own reality. When enough people expect the impossible, ordinary moments often become extraordinary in memory. Some stories describe the völva lifting her staff toward the roof, as though greeting someone standing above. Others insist she whispered names forgotten by ordinary people centuries earlier. The listeners dared not interrupt. They feared that doing so might draw the attention of whatever had answered. Perhaps these tales grew larger each time they were retold. Perhaps frightened witnesses added details their grandchildren accepted as truth. Or perhaps something happened within those halls that language has never adequately captured. Whatever the answer may be, one belief remained remarkably consistent throughout the Norse world. Certain nights were considered thinner than others. During the longest winter darkness, when snow buried the fields and wolves howled beyond the edge of the trees, the distance separating humanity from the unseen world seemed dangerously small. Doors were barred earlier. Offerings were left outside homes. Travelers hurried to reach shelter before sunset. Even experienced warriors avoided wandering alone through sacred groves after nightfall, because according to the oldest traditions, there were places where the living were never truly alone. And among all those forbidden places, none inspired greater awe than the silent forests where the first sacrifices had once been made, beneath trees so ancient that even the oldest storytellers could no longer remember who had planted them. Morning did not erase what had happened during the night. As the first pale light spread across the frozen valleys, the great hall slowly returned to its ordinary purpose. Fires were rebuilt for cooking. Children emerged from their homes. Fishermen prepared their boats, while farmers inspected fences buried beneath fresh snow. Life appeared unchanged. Yet those who had witnessed the gathering carried something invisible with them. Some left with hope, others with unease. A few refused to speak of the ceremony ever again. Whether the visions had revealed genuine glimpses of the future or merely reflected the fears already hidden within human hearts mattered surprisingly little. The ritual had served its purpose. Questions had been asked. The unseen world had answered in its own mysterious language. Before the sun climbed high enough to brighten the fjord, the völva was usually gone. She accepted no permanent home. No village claimed her as its own. Like the ravens that crossed the northern sky with changing seasons, she wandered from settlement to settlement, carrying stories, prophecies, and secrets gathered over decades of endless travel. Some believed the roads themselves guided her feet. Others insisted that Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, whispered directions into her dreams long before each journey began. The people never asked where she would go next. Some questions were considered disrespectful. Others were simply believed to have no answer that ordinary minds could understand. Over generations, these wandering seers became surrounded by countless legends. Some were almost certainly exaggerated. Others may have preserved fragments of forgotten truth. One tale told of a Völva who arrived at a village already knowing the name of every child born during the previous winter. Another claimed a woman predicted the collapse of an entire mountainside several weeks before it buried a cluster of farmhouses beneath thousands of tons of stone. A third described a seer who refused food, claiming she had already eaten at a feast that would not occur until the following summer. No one could explain such stories. No one expected to. Among the Norse people, mystery itself possessed value. Not every secret deserved solving. Some existed simply because the world remained larger than human understanding. This acceptance of uncertainty shaped nearly every aspect of Viking spirituality. Unlike many later religious traditions that sought fixed answers, Norse belief embraced contradiction. A prophecy could warn of disaster without making that disaster unavoidable. Fate might be written, yet courage still mattered. The gods themselves knew Ragnarök would one day destroy their world, but they continued fighting against that destiny nonetheless. To live bravely in the face of inevitable loss became one of the highest virtues imaginable. The Völur occupied a strange place within this philosophy. They did not claim to control fate. They claimed only to glimpse the threads from which fate was woven. Those invisible threads were known collectively as weird. Though the exact meaning shifts between different Germanic traditions, the concept remained deeply influential throughout the Viking Age. Every life formed part of an immense tapestry stretching across generations. No action existed in isolation. Every promise echoed into the future. Every betrayal left scars beyond the immediate victim. Every sacrifice strengthened or weakened the invisible pattern binding the world together. To disturb that pattern carelessly invited consequences no one could predict. For this reason, rituals followed precise traditions. The smallest mistake could transform blessing into misfortune. A word spoken incorrectly, an offering placed in the wrong direction, a fire extinguished too early. Even silence carried rules. Certain moments demanded absolute stillness. Others required every voice to join together without hesitation. Modern archaeology cannot recover spoken prayers. Wooden temples have largely vanished. Songs disappeared long before anyone thought to write them down. Yet excavations across Scandinavia continue uncovering subtle clues that reveal astonishing attention to ritual detail. Ceremonial buildings were often aligned with the rising sun during particular seasons. Sacred wells contained carefully selected objects deposited over centuries. Animal skulls appeared arranged according to patterns unlikely to have formed by accident. Every discovery suggests a people who viewed ritual not as superstition, but as an essential part of maintaining harmony between humanity and forces beyond human control. Among these discoveries, one pattern appears with remarkable consistency. Birds, especially ravens. Their bones appear in unusual contexts. Their feathers accompany high-status burials. Their images decorate weapons, jewelry, helmets, and carved wooden posts. The reason was obvious to every Viking. Ravens belonged to Odin. They watched battlefields. They consumed the dead. Most importantly, they traveled freely between places humans could not reach. Each evening, according to tradition, Hugin and Munin returned to Odin, carrying news gathered from every corner of the world. Thought, memory, two birds, two eternal witnesses. It is hardly surprising that the appearance of ravens during rituals was treated with extraordinary seriousness. If one landed nearby, people watched carefully. If two appeared together, conversation often stopped entirely. If neither bird nor animal made any sound at all, the silence itself became an omen. Nature was constantly speaking. The challenge lay in learning its language. This desire to interpret hidden signs extended beyond birds. The crackling of fire, the movement of smoke, the pattern left by melting snow, the behavior of wolves, the sudden arrival of thick fog over calm water. Everything could become meaningful. Nothing happened entirely by chance. To outsiders, this worldview sometimes appeared exhausting. To the Vikings, it created order within an unpredictable universe. If the gods communicated through creation, then careful observation became an act of wisdom. Perhaps nowhere was this belief more powerful than during the practice known as Seiðr. Unlike ordinary ceremonies performed for an entire community, Seiðr occupied a far stranger place within Norse tradition. Even medieval writers struggled to describe it clearly. Some referred to it as prophecy. Others called it sorcery. A few condemned it as dangerous magic capable of altering reality itself. The truth was likely more complicated than any single definition. Seiðr blurred the boundary between religion, ritual, psychology, and performance. Those who practiced it entered altered states of consciousness through prolonged chanting, rhythmic movement, controlled breathing, and carefully structured ceremonies. Within these states, they believed they could perceive possibilities hidden from ordinary sight. Some sought knowledge, others sought healing. A handful pursued vengeance. The practice carried enormous respect. It also carried enormous risk. According to old traditions, opening one's mind to unseen forces meant accepting that something might also look back. For this reason, Seiðr demanded preparation lasting days or even weeks. Participants purified themselves. Certain foods were avoided. Arguments within the household were settled before the ritual began. Weapons remained outside the ceremonial space unless specifically required. The purpose was not merely symbolic. Harmony among the living was believed to prevent unwanted visitors from the unseen world. One surviving saga describes a gathering where every participant was instructed to wear freshly cleaned clothing woven from undyed wool. Another insists no iron could cross the ritual circle until the ceremony ended. Whether these rules reflected actual historical practice or literary embellishment remains uncertain. Yet their persistence across multiple sources suggests they preserved echoes of authentic traditions. As darkness deepened, the atmosphere changed. Torches were extinguished one by one until only the central fire remained. Its light flickered across carved pillars blackened by generations of smoke. Animal skins hanging along the walls seemed almost alive as shadows drifted across them. No one spoke without permission. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Then the singing began. Not loudly, not dramatically. One voice, then another. Gradually, the entire hall breathed together through music older than memory itself. The melody rose and fell like waves striking a distant shore. Its rhythm never hurried. Its purpose was not entertainment. It guided the mind toward places ordinary thought could never reach. Some listeners later claimed they no longer felt the floor beneath their feet. Others described hearing additional voices joining the song from somewhere beyond the walls. No doors opened. No strangers entered. Yet many insisted the hall no longer contained only the living. Whether this resulted from exhaustion, expectation, or genuine spiritual experience cannot be answered after 1,000 years. The experience itself mattered more than its explanation. The Völva remained perfectly still. Only her breathing changed. Slow, measured, almost imperceptible. The carved staff rested across her knees. Her fingertips lightly traced symbols worn smooth by decades of use. Each mark represented knowledge inherited from teachers whose names had vanished long before the first written sagas appeared. Then, without warning, her eyes opened. Not with surprise, not with fear, but with the distant expression of someone returning from an unimaginably long journey. When she finally spoke, witnesses claimed her voice no longer sounded entirely her own. And according to the oldest whispers carried through the northern kingdoms, it was during moments like these that the living came closest to hearing the forgotten names of powers that existed long before Odin himself claimed the halls of Asgard. The old stories never agreed on what those forgotten powers truly were. Some claimed they were ancient spirits that had watched over the forests before the first gods established their dominion. Others believed they were echoes left behind by generations of ancestors whose names had disappeared from memory, but whose presence lingered wherever blood had once been spilled upon sacred ground. There were even whispers that some forces had no names at all. To give them a name was thought to invite their attention. So the wisest among the Norse simply referred to them as the Old Ones, not as gods to be worshipped, but as beings that had always existed beyond the edge of human understanding. Whether anyone genuinely believed such stories is difficult to determine. The Viking Age was never a single, unified culture. Communities separated by mountains, forests, and vast stretches of sea often developed their own traditions over countless generations. One village might dismiss a legend as foolish superstition. Another might organize an entire seasonal festival around the very same tale. This diversity is one reason Viking spirituality remains so fascinating today. There was no single sacred book, no supreme priesthood, no universal authority deciding which beliefs were correct. Instead, traditions lived within the memories of ordinary people. Grandparents taught grandchildren. Travelers exchanged stories beside winter fires. Sailors carried unfamiliar customs from one coastline to another. Each generation added something new while preserving fragments of something impossibly old. As centuries passed, these fragments accumulated into a vast landscape of legends, where history and myth became impossible to separate. Among these traditions, few were regarded with greater caution than the belief that fate could occasionally reveal itself through dreams. Dreams occupied a remarkable position in Norse society. Modern cultures often dismiss them as random creations of the sleeping mind. The Vikings rarely made such a distinction. Sleep represented another journey. While the body rested, the spirit wandered. Sometimes it traveled only through memory. Sometimes it crossed invisible boundaries separating Midgard from places no waking person could reach. Many important decisions were influenced by dreams. A chieftain who dreamed of broken oars might postpone a voyage. A hunter who saw wolves surrounding his home could spend the next morning making offerings before entering the forest. Parents carefully remembered unusual dreams experienced by young children, believing the gods occasionally favored innocent minds with glimpses of events yet to come. The Völur paid especially close attention to these nighttime visions. Visitors often arrived carrying nothing more than a single dream they could not understand. Perhaps they had seen a serpent coiled around the roots of a great tree. Perhaps a dead relative had appeared without speaking. Perhaps ravens had flown backward across the sky. Every image mattered. Every detail deserved examination. The Völva listened patiently before offering an interpretation that often sounded more like poetry than prophecy. A serpent might represent hidden wisdom, or betrayal, or approaching change. The answer depended entirely upon the dreamer's life. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything belonged to a greater pattern. This philosophy extended into another mysterious practice that appears repeatedly throughout Norse literature: the sending of the spirit. Several Icelandic sagas describe gifted seers whose consciousness could leave the body for brief periods. Some claim to travel across enormous distances. Others describe transforming into birds or wolves, while their physical form remained motionless. To modern readers, such accounts resemble fantasy. Yet similar beliefs appear in numerous ancient cultures across northern Eurasia. Whether understood literally or symbolically, they reveal how deeply the Vikings believed consciousness could move beyond ordinary limitations. One particularly haunting legend tells of a Völva who fell into such a profound trance that villagers believed she had died. Her breathing became almost impossible to detect. Her skin grew pale beneath the firelight. Hours passed. No one dared touch her. At sunrise, she suddenly inhaled as though emerging from deep water. When asked where she had been, she answered only that she had walked beneath roots thicker than mountains and listened to rivers that flowed upward instead of down. She refused to say anything more. Within a month, according to the story, an epidemic spread through neighboring settlements exactly as she had warned. Whether the account preserves historical memory or later imagination can never be known. Stories like these survived because they spoke to something universal. Humanity has always wondered what lies beyond ordinary perception. The Vikings simply expressed that curiosity through the language of their own world. Yet not every ritual sought hidden knowledge. Many addressed far more immediate concerns. Northern winters could be merciless. A single failed harvest threatened entire communities. Livestock died beneath heavy snow. Fishing grounds froze unexpectedly. Disease spread quickly through isolated settlements where help might never arrive. In such circumstances, faith became inseparable from survival. Communities gathered throughout the year to seek favor from the gods. Offerings of grain, fresh bread, ale, honey, milk, the first fish caught in spring, the strongest ram born that season. Everything valuable reflected gratitude for life itself. No gift was considered too small if given with proper respect. These ceremonies strengthened more than spiritual belief. They strengthened communities. Entire villages shared meals together. Disputes were settled before rituals began. Old grievances were forgiven. Families renewed alliances. Young people met future husbands and wives beneath banners raised for sacred festivals. Religion, politics, family, and survival blended into one inseparable whole. To remove ritual from Viking society would have been impossible. It shaped every season, every birth, every marriage, every voyage, every funeral, even every oath. Among the most sacred promises a Viking could make was an oath sworn before both witnesses and the gods. Breaking such an oath endangered more than personal honor. It threatened the invisible order connecting humanity to divine powers. Some believed oath-breakers carried misfortune wherever they traveled. Others feared their descendants would inherit the consequences of their dishonor. Runestones occasionally preserve these solemn declarations. Sagas celebrate men and women who upheld impossible promises despite terrible personal cost. Honor possessed tangible spiritual value. Perhaps that explains why betrayal appears so frequently within Norse legend. Not because betrayal was common, but because it violated the very foundation upon which society rested. Still, beneath every public ceremony existed another layer known only to a trusted few. Not because the knowledge itself was evil, because power without wisdom invited disaster. A young apprentice could spend years observing rituals before participating directly. Patience became its own lesson. Those unable to master themselves could never hope to master sacred tradition. Old tales describe apprentices gathering herbs beneath moonlight without speaking a single word. Others spent entire nights listening to forests instead of sleeping. Some memorized hundreds of verses whose meanings unfolded only after decades of experience. Knowledge arrived slowly, like snow gathering upon mountain peaks, one winter after another, never all at once. It was during this long process of learning that students first encountered the oldest symbols known throughout the Norse world. Simple lines, sharp angles, marks that appeared almost insignificant to unfamiliar eyes. Yet according to tradition, each carried immense power. Some represented protection, others guidance. Others still warned against forces no ordinary weapon could overcome. These were not merely letters. They were believed to contain echoes of creation itself, the runes. And according to one of the oldest legends ever preserved in the North, the price paid to obtain them was greater than any sacrifice made before or since. The story began not upon the earth, but high among the endless branches of Yggdrasil, where Odin willingly embraced death itself in exchange for knowledge, that would forever change both gods and men. If the Völur were the keepers of hidden wisdom, then the runes were the language through which that wisdom could be touched. To the modern eye, they appear simple, a collection of straight lines carved into stone, wood, bone, or metal. Their sharp angles seem practical rather than mysterious, designed to be cut quickly with a knife instead of written with ink. Yet no Viking would have looked upon them as ordinary letters. A rune was never merely a sound. It was an idea, a force, a fragment of the hidden order that shaped the universe itself. Every mark possessed a name. Every name carried meaning. Every meaning reflected something larger than the symbol carved into wood. This belief began with a story older than any kingdom in Scandinavia. Long before human kings ruled the fjords, Odin desired a form of knowledge unlike any other. He had already sacrificed one of his eyes at Mimir's well. He had traveled farther than any god. He had questioned giants, wandered among mortals, and searched every corner of the 9 realms. Still, he believed something greater remained beyond his reach. So he chose a path no other god dared follow. According to the old poems, Odin climbed Yggdrasil, the world tree itself. No one forced him. No enemy pursued him. The sacrifice was entirely his own. He pierced his body with his spear and hung suspended from the great ash tree. 9 days, 9 nights. No food, no water, no comfort. Only pain, only silence. Only endless darkness stretching beneath the roots of creation. The old verses describe ravens circling overhead, while unseen creatures watched from below. Cold winds tore through the branches. Blood dripped into the void beneath him, yet Odin refused to release his grip. He remained suspended between life and death, no longer fully belonging to either world. Then, at the very edge of oblivion, he saw them, not created, not invented, discovered, the runes. They rose before him from the depths beneath Yggdrasil, like hidden truths waiting for someone willing to pay their terrible price. As he reached toward them, understanding flooded his mind. Words gained power. Names gained weight. Reality itself could be influenced through symbols that reflected the deepest structure of existence. When Odin finally fell from the tree, he was forever changed. The sacrifice had not made him stronger. It had made him wiser. To the Vikings, this distinction mattered profoundly. Strength won battles. Wisdom determined whether those battles should be fought at all. Because Odin had suffered to obtain the runes, no one believed they should be used carelessly. Knowledge demanded responsibility. Every carved symbol carried echoes of the sacrifice that first revealed it. Whether this legend reflected genuine religious belief or poetic metaphor hardly mattered. Its influence spread across the Viking world. Runes appeared everywhere, on swords, on shields, on ships, on jewelry, on walking staffs, on drinking horns, on children's toys, on the entrances to homes. Even the simplest wooden combs occasionally bore carefully carved symbols. Some identified ownership, others commemorated the dead. Many likely served practical purposes, no different from ordinary writing. Yet alongside these everyday uses existed another tradition, one wrapped in mystery, one that blurred the boundary between literacy and magic. Certain runes were believed to protect, others could bless a voyage. Some promised victory, others warned against betrayal. No single rune accomplished miracles by itself. Their power depended upon intention, knowledge, and proper use. A symbol carved by an inexperienced hand remained little more than decoration. Placed by someone who understood the old traditions, however, it became something altogether different. The sagas preserve countless stories illustrating this belief. A warrior carved protective runes upon his sword before battle. A sailor marked his mast before crossing dangerous waters. A mother placed tiny symbols beneath her infant's cradle. Whether these practices altered reality or simply strengthened confidence is impossible to determine. But confidence itself has always shaped human history. An army convinced the gods marched beside it, often fought with astonishing courage. A sailor who believed divine protection guarded his vessel might face storms others considered hopeless. Faith changes behavior. Behavior changes history. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Runes also served another purpose: memory. Scandinavia's landscape remains scattered with standing stones raised more than 1,000 years ago. Many still bear inscriptions carved deeply into granite. Some honor fallen sons. Others commemorate successful voyages. Several describe bridges, churches, or family inheritance after Christianity reached the north. Yet the oldest stones possess an unmistakable quality. They speak not merely to the living, they seem to address eternity itself. Every carved line resisted wind, snow, rain, generations. Long after voices disappeared, the stone continued speaking. In a world where stories passed mainly through memory, such permanence possessed extraordinary value. The dead were never entirely forgotten while their names remained visible beneath the open sky. For the Vikings, memory itself approached immortality. Perhaps that explains why Odin valued Hugin and Munin so greatly. Thought and memory. Without memory, courage vanished. Without thought, memory lost meaning. The runes united both. They preserved knowledge while inviting contemplation. Yet among all the symbols carved throughout Scandinavia, none inspired greater fascination than those whose meanings became lost. Archaeologists occasionally discover inscriptions that refuse translation. Some employ combinations never seen elsewhere. Others appear intentionally concealed beneath overlapping patterns. Were they coded messages, religious formulas, protective charms, or something else entirely? No one knows. The mystery only deepens with time. One remarkable legend, preserved in later Icelandic tradition, tells of a young craftsman who believed he understood the runes after only a few months of study. Eager to impress his village, he carved symbols upon a sick girl's bed, claiming they would restore her health. Instead, her condition worsened. An elderly traveler eventually examined the carvings before quietly scraping them away. The old man then carved new runes in their place. According to the tale, the girl recovered within days. Whether the story reflects genuine belief or serves merely as a warning against arrogance, its lesson remains unmistakable. Knowledge without wisdom becomes dangerous. Even the most sacred gift can become destructive in careless hands. Such lessons shaped Viking attitudes toward every form of hidden learning. Power itself was never evil. Irresponsibility was. This philosophy extended far beyond carved symbols. It reached into healing, into prophecy, into warfare, into death, especially death. For no event demanded greater ritual care than the passing of a human life. Every funeral represented far more than grief. It became the final opportunity to prepare someone's journey beyond Midgard. The smallest mistake might leave a spirit wandering without peace. The greatest honor ensured safe passage toward its destined realm. Different communities developed different customs. Some buried their dead beneath enormous mounds overlooking the sea. Others chose quiet cemeteries beside family farms. Powerful chieftains occasionally rested within magnificent ships pulled onto land before burial. Weapons accompanied warriors. Tools accompanied craftsmen. Jewelry accompanied women. Children received treasured possessions despite lives cut tragically short. Nothing essential could be forgotten. Life beyond death required preparation, just as life upon earth required planning. Yet among these familiar customs emerged darker accounts recorded by outsiders. Travelers from distant lands described funerals unlike anything they had witnessed before. Ceremonies lasting several days. Endless feasting beside the body. Animals sacrificed in carefully ordered sequence. Strange songs carried across the water at sunset. One observer claimed an entire ship became a floating tomb, consumed by fire. Another described servants volunteering to accompany their master into death. Whether every detail survives unchanged through history remains uncertain. Some chroniclers misunderstood what they witnessed. Others exaggerated unfamiliar customs for dramatic effect. Yet archaeological discoveries continue revealing evidence that at least some extraordinary funerary rituals truly occurred. Ships buried beneath earth, burned weapons, sacrificed horses, imported treasures gathered from lands thousands of miles away. Death occupied the center of Viking imagination because it represented transition rather than disappearance. The living honored the dead. The dead continued influencing the living. Ancestors protected descendants. Descendants preserved ancestral memory. Neither world existed entirely apart from the other. And nowhere did those two worlds seem closer than during the final night before a great funeral, when torches illuminated silent ships resting upon dark waters, and every soul present understood that by sunrise, one more traveler would begin a journey from which no mortal had ever returned. The final night rarely belonged to silence. While the body of the deceased rested beneath carefully woven blankets, surrounded by treasured possessions gathered over an entire lifetime, the living remained awake. Friends shared memories that grew more vivid with every passing hour. Old warriors spoke of distant voyages across unfamiliar seas. Mothers recalled childhood laughter that had echoed through the village decades earlier. Children listened quietly, hearing stories about people they had never truly known. The purpose was not simply remembrance. Among the Norse, memory itself possessed power. As long as someone continued speaking your name, a part of you remained present in the world of the living. To be forgotten represented a second death, one far more permanent than the first. This belief explains why Viking poetry held such extraordinary importance. Skalds, the professional poets of the North, did far more than entertain. They preserved reputations. A great poem could carry a warrior's name across generations. A forgotten life vanished almost as completely as footprints beneath fresh snow. Honor therefore depended not only upon brave deeds, but upon witnesses willing to remember them. As darkness deepened, preparations for the funeral continued with remarkable precision. Weapons were cleaned, jewelry polished, favorite drinking horns filled one final time. Even clothing mattered. The dead were dressed with care, not because appearance held value for lifeless eyes, but because the journey ahead demanded dignity. No traveler willingly entered an unknown land poorly prepared. The next world deserved at least the same respect as this one. Nearby, craftsmen worked through the night. Some repaired damaged shields that would never again face battle. Others reinforced the timbers of a burial ship. Every hammer strike echoed across the quiet shoreline, mingling with waves that lapped gently against weathered wood. To later generations, the idea of burying immense ships beneath the earth appears astonishing. To the Vikings, it made perfect sense. Ships had carried them throughout life. Ships would carry them beyond death. The vessel became both coffin and bridge. A final voyage awaiting favorable winds no living sailor could predict. Not every funeral involved a ship. Only the wealthiest families possessed resources great enough for such ceremonies. Most people received simpler burials. Yet regardless of status, nearly every funeral followed one essential principle. The dead never traveled empty-handed. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia reveal astonishing variety. Iron knives, cooking pots, keys, combs, glass beads imported from the Middle East, silver coins from distant kingdoms, gaming pieces carved from antler, small wooden chests, musical instruments, even household tools. Each object reflected part of a person's identity. Life had shaped these possessions. Now those same possessions would accompany their owner into whatever awaited beyond. Some graves contained remarkably little. Others overflowed with unimaginable wealth. One burial might include a single family brooch carefully placed upon folded clothing. Another revealed elaborate wagons, richly decorated sleds, dozens of sacrificed animals, and imported luxury goods gathered from across Europe and Asia. Such discoveries remind us that the Viking world reached astonishing distances. Their ships crossed the Atlantic. They sailed the rivers of Eastern Europe. They traded in Constantinople. They traveled as far as the Abbasid Caliphate. Every journey carried home unfamiliar treasures. Some became symbols of status. Others eventually found their way into graves where no living person would ever see them again. To modern historians, this deliberate burial of priceless objects raises an obvious question. Why remove such wealth from the community forever? The answer lies within Viking ideas about ownership. Possessions did not merely belong to someone. They became extensions of that person's life. A warrior's sword accumulated memory with every battle. A craftsman's tools carried years of skilled labor. A mother's necklace reflected countless family celebrations and quiet evenings beside the hearth. Separating those objects from their owner after death may have seemed as unnatural as separating memory from identity itself. The funeral, therefore, restored balance. The dead departed with what truly belonged to them. The living accepted temporary loss in exchange for eternal order. Among the countless graves uncovered across Scandinavia, a small number continue to puzzle archaeologists. Some bodies were buried sitting upright instead of lying down. Others rested beneath enormous piles of carefully selected stones. A few graves contained bent swords placed deliberately beyond repair, spears snapped in half, shields broken apart, axes with shattered handles. At first glance, these objects appear ruined, yet destruction itself formed part of the ritual. Many scholars believe the Vikings intentionally killed these possessions. Just as the owner's earthly life had ended, so too had the useful life of the objects that served them. Only then could both continue together into another realm. Death transformed everything it touched. Nothing crossed unchanged. Fire played an equally important role. Throughout the Viking Age, cremation remained widespread across much of Scandinavia, though burial practices varied significantly by region and period. The flames consumed flesh. Smoke rose toward the heavens. Ashes settled back upon the earth. To observers, the process represented more than physical destruction. Fire purified. It released. It separated the spirit from the body that had sheltered it since birth. Many ancient cultures viewed fire as a messenger. The Vikings were no exception. Whatever entered the flames no longer belonged entirely to the world of humanity. It had begun another journey. Perhaps the most famous account of a Viking funeral comes not from Scandinavia itself, but from a traveler who witnessed one with his own eyes. In the 10th century, the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan journeyed northward along the Volga River. There he encountered Norse merchants known today as the Rus. His observations remain among the most valuable first-hand descriptions of Viking-era ritual ever recorded. He described days of preparation, animals sacrificed one after another, a great ship drawn onto land, the body of a powerful leader placed within a wooden chamber, rich fabrics, weapons, food, drink, music. Then came the fire. The entire vessel disappeared beneath towering flames until nothing remained except glowing embers beneath an open sky. Ibn Fadlan watched with fascination and horror. Many details of his account have been debated by historians. Yet, archaeological discoveries have repeatedly confirmed that magnificent ship burials truly existed. His testimony, though filtered through the eyes of an outsider, captured something undeniably authentic about the Viking understanding of death. Still, one aspect of his narrative continues to provoke discussion more than any other. He described the voluntary death of a young servant who chose to accompany her master into the afterlife. Whether such events occurred frequently or represented exceptional circumstances remains uncertain. Evidence suggests they were extraordinarily rare, Even so, the account illustrates the immense seriousness with which some communities approach the boundary between life and death. To them, loyalty did not necessarily end with the final breath. It could extend beyond it. As centuries passed, stories surrounding these magnificent funerals gradually grew more elaborate. People spoke of ghostly ships appearing within sea mist shortly before dawn. Fishermen claimed to hear distant oars striking invisible water on calm nights. Children listened as grandparents warned never to answer voices drifting across empty fjords after sunset. Those voices, they said, belonged to travelers still searching for the shore they had failed to reach in death. Whether anyone truly believed such tales hardly matters. The stories endured because they reflected a deeper truth about Viking culture. The boundary separating the living from the dead remained astonishingly thin. Death ended a heartbeat. It did not end existence, and according to some of the oldest legends whispered beside northern fires, there were rare individuals who possessed the knowledge to cross that fragile boundary willingly, returning with messages that no ordinary person was ever meant to hear. Not every voice belonged to the living. For the Vikings, this was not merely a frightening thought whispered to children during long winter nights. It was a possibility that shaped the way entire communities understood the world around them. The dead were gone. Yet, they were never entirely absent. A grandfather who had guided his family through decades of harsh winters did not simply disappear because his body rested beneath a burial mound. A mother, whose wisdom had preserved her household through famine, was not believed to vanish into nothingness. A warrior whose courage had protected his village continued to exist somewhere beyond the horizon of ordinary sight. The question was never whether they remained. The question was whether they should be disturbed. Most traditions insisted they should not. The dead required peace. Their journey belonged to them alone. The living honored them with offerings, remembered their names, and visited their graves during important seasons of the year. Beyond that, the boundary separating both worlds deserved respect. Crossing it without necessity invited consequences no one could fully predict. Yet history rarely follows perfect rules. Every generation eventually encounters moments when grief becomes stronger than caution. A father loses his only son. A queen dies before revealing the location of an alliance that could prevent war. A terrible illness spreads from one settlement to another without explanation. Harvests fail. Children vanish inside winter storms. Fear has always persuaded humanity to seek answers wherever they might exist. Sometimes, those answers were believed to lie with the dead themselves. It was under such extraordinary circumstances that the oldest stories speak of ceremonies unlike any other. These were not funerals. They were not celebrations. Nor were they ordinary acts of worship. They were attempts to stand at the very edge of life and call softly into the darkness beyond. Unlike the public rituals held inside the village hall, these ceremonies almost always took place far from ordinary homes. The chosen location mattered enormously. Crossroads where ancient paths met, lonely hills overlooking forgotten valleys, burial mounds untouched for generations, groves where the oldest trees formed natural circles beneath the stars, places already associated with memory, places where countless lives had begun and ended. The Vikings believed that landscapes themselves remembered. A battlefield remembered blood. A sacred spring remembered every offering cast into its depths. A burial mound remembered every promise spoken above it. Time did not erase these memories. It layered them upon one another until certain places seemed almost alive with invisible history. Archaeologists today have uncovered remarkable evidence supporting the extraordinary importance of such locations. Large burial mounds dominate parts of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Some contain magnificent ships. Others conceal elaborate wooden chambers beneath enormous hills of earth and stone. Many remained places of ritual activity long after the original burial. People continued visiting them, leaving gifts, lighting fires, holding seasonal gatherings nearby. The dead remained members of the community. simply living elsewhere. Several medieval sagas describe individuals spending entire nights beside ancestral graves. Some sought guidance before difficult decisions. Others hoped to receive prophetic dreams. One famous account tells of a man sleeping upon his father's burial mound before setting out to reclaim stolen family land. By dawn, he claimed to possess knowledge no living witness could have provided. Whether the story reflects literal belief or symbolic storytelling, it reveals something profound. The grave was not viewed as a wall. It was viewed as a doorway. Most people lacked the courage to approach it. Those who did rarely returned unchanged. Among the Norse, one of the oldest words associated with such encounters was draugr. Modern popular culture often imagines the draugr as little more than a Viking zombie. The original tradition was considerably more unsettling. A draugr was not simply a corpse that walked. It was a being whose will remained so powerful that death itself failed to contain it. Some guarded hidden treasure. Others protected family lands. A few wandered endlessly, driven by anger, jealousy, or unfinished purpose. Unlike ghosts in many later traditions, the draugr possessed physical strength. The sagas describe them breaking doors from their hinges, crushing warriors, destroying livestock, spreading sickness wherever they traveled. They could grow to enormous size. Their skin darkened like weathered bark. Their eyes glowed with unnatural intensity. Some carried the smell of seawater and freshly turned earth. Others were said to appear exactly as they had during life, until moonlight revealed something terribly wrong beneath familiar features. Were these stories intended as literal truth? Perhaps. Or perhaps they served another purpose. The Vikings respected courage. Yet courage without wisdom easily became recklessness. The legends reminded listeners that disturbing the dead carried genuine danger. Not every ancestor wished to be remembered. Not every spirit welcomed company. Interestingly, archaeological evidence suggests the Norse occasionally took practical steps that seemed designed to prevent certain individuals from returning. A handful of graves contain unusually large stones placed directly upon the body. Others reveal iron objects positioned across the chest or neck. Some skeletons appear carefully pinned beneath heavy timber. Modern researchers propose many explanations. Protection against scavenging animals, structural support for collapsing graves, or perhaps ritual precautions rooted in beliefs now largely forgotten. The evidence refuses simple answers. History often does. Still, fear alone cannot explain why people continued approaching burial mounds despite the risks. Hope played an equally powerful role. Hope that unfinished conversations might somehow continue. Hope that guidance could still be found. Hope that love extended beyond death itself. No civilization willingly creates elaborate rituals for something it believes impossible. The Vikings invested enormous care in maintaining relationships with their ancestors. Food offerings appeared beside graves. Drinking horns were occasionally left near burial sites during seasonal festivals. Families gathered upon ancestral land not merely because tradition required it, but because memory itself strengthened identity. Every generation inherited more than property. It inherited obligation. One belonged to the family that came before. One prepared the way for those yet to be born. Between these generations stood the ancestors, forever watching. At least, that was the belief. Certain individuals claimed they could perceive these unseen witnesses more clearly than others. Once again, the Völur occupied the center of such traditions. Contrary to later misconceptions, they did not summon armies of spirits to perform impossible feats. The surviving sources suggest something far more restrained, far more solemn. They listened. That distinction mattered. Rather than commanding the dead, they sought permission to hear what remained hidden. Some ceremonies began with offerings of bread soaked in ale. Others required small gifts of silver, buried quietly beneath ancient trees. The purpose was never payment. It was respect. One did not arrive empty-handed before powers older than kings. As twilight settled across the landscape, participants formed a quiet procession toward the chosen burial mound. No music accompanied them. No torches unless absolutely necessary. The moon provided enough light. Its pale glow transformed familiar hills into something strangely unfamiliar. Snow reflected silver beneath the stars. Every breath became visible. Every footstep sounded unnaturally loud against frozen ground. Those present often removed weapons before approaching. Steel belonged to the world of conflict. The place they entered demanded peace. Only the ceremonial staff remained. Carried slowly by the Völva, as though marking each step between one world and another. She stopped several paces before the mound. No one crossed farther. The boundary belonged to the dead. Silence settled over the gathering. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb that moment. Then came the oldest part of the ritual. Not magic, not commands. Names. One after another, the names of ancestors were spoken aloud. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, warriors, mothers, children whose lives had ended before memory itself could fully form. Each name acknowledged, each life remembered. The ceremony reminded everyone present that they stood upon land shaped by generations who had sacrificed everything so the living might stand there tonight. Only after every remembered name had been spoken did the Völva lower the tip of her staff until it touched the frozen earth. Witnesses were instructed to close their eyes, not because something terrifying would appear, because what truly mattered could never be seen with ordinary sight. The chants that followed differed from those performed inside the village hall. These were slower, older, almost impossible to distinguish from the sound of the wind moving through distant pine branches. The words themselves have been lost. No manuscript preserves them. No saga records them completely. Only fragments survive, enough to suggest they belong to traditions already ancient, when the Viking Age itself was still young. How long the chanting lasted varied according to each story. Perhaps minutes, perhaps hours. Time seemed strangely unimportant. Those who later described the experience rarely remembered its duration. Instead, they remembered sensations. The air growing colder despite the fire. The strange feeling that someone had quietly joined the circle. The unmistakable certainty that unseen eyes were observing every movement. Most returned home before dawn. Some claimed nothing unusual occurred. Others refused to discuss the night ever again. And according to one of the oldest legends preserved in western Norway, a single Völva once remained alone beside such a burial mound until sunrise, where she claimed to have received a warning so terrible that even after returning to her village, she spoke of it only once. Her words foretold not the death of a single person, not the fall of a single kingdom, but the beginning of a darkness that would one day threaten every realm beneath the branches of Yggdrasil. The Vikings knew that prophecy by only one name: Ragnarök. By the time the first rays of sunlight reached the snowy peaks, the Völva had already vanished from the burial mound. No footprints marked the path she had taken. The wind had erased them before anyone arrived. Only the circle of flattened snow remained, surrounding the ancient grave like the fading outline of a forgotten memory. The villagers searched her face when she returned. They expected reassurance. Instead, they found silence. She accepted neither food nor drink. She removed her weathered cloak, laid her carved staff beside the fire, and stared into the flames for so long that even the boldest warriors chose not to interrupt. When she finally spoke, her words were quiet enough that everyone leaned closer. She did not speak of an enemy fleet. She did not predict a failed harvest. She did not warn of plague or famine. She spoke of a future that reached far beyond the lives of everyone listening. A future already woven into the fabric of creation itself. Among all the stories preserved by the Norse people, none inspired greater awe than the prophecy of Ragnarök. It was not simply the end of the world. It was the end of certainty, the end of order, the final moment when gods, giants, monsters, and humanity would all be swept into the same unimaginable storm. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Vikings never believed their gods were immortal. Powerful, yes. Wise, often. Fearsome beyond measure. But eternal? Never. Even Odin knew the day would come when his wisdom could no longer prevent destiny from unfolding. Thor, the mighty defender of Midgard, would one day face an enemy he could not survive. Freyr would stand unarmed against overwhelming darkness. Even the world tree itself would tremble. This remarkable belief shaped the Viking understanding of courage. If even the gods could not escape fate, then bravery could never depend upon the certainty of victory. True courage meant standing firm, despite knowing the outcome. This idea echoed throughout every aspect of Norse life. A sailor launched his ship despite knowing storms might claim it. A farmer planted crops despite the possibility of early frost. A warrior entered battle despite understanding that every sword carried death within its edge. Life gained meaning not because it lasted forever, but because every moment demanded courage. The prophecy itself unfolded through a series of terrible signs. The first was Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter. Not one ordinary season. 3 endless winters, without a single summer between them. Snow would fall from every direction. The sun would offer little warmth. Rivers would freeze. Harvests would fail. Neighbors would turn against one another. Brothers would draw swords. Families would collapse beneath hunger and suspicion. The old bonds holding society together would slowly unravel. Whether such stories emerged from memories of real climate disasters remains impossible to know. Northern Europe experienced countless brutal winters throughout history. Entire communities vanished beneath starvation. Perhaps ancient memories of those tragedies gradually transformed into prophecy. Or perhaps the prophecy shaped how later generations interpreted every unusually harsh season. Either way, fear of the Great Winter remained deeply rooted in Norse imagination. When snow arrived earlier than expected, people noticed. When summer proved unusually cold, old stories resurfaced around evening fires. The world itself seemed capable of reminding humanity that ancient warnings still lingered beneath the surface. After Fimbulwinter came stranger omens. The wolves, Skoll and Hati, forever chasing the sun and moon across the heavens, would finally catch their prey. Darkness would swallow the sky. Stars would disappear. Mountains would shake. The earth would split open. The seas would rise beyond every shoreline. To modern listeners, these descriptions resemble epic mythology. To those who first told them, they represented something far more personal. Nature had always possessed unimaginable power. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, storm surges, avalanches. The North constantly reminded its people that civilization existed only by temporary permission. Perhaps no image captured this truth more vividly than Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, so enormous that it circled the entire world beneath the sea, holding its own tail between its jaws. As long as the serpent remained beneath the waves, the oceans stayed within their boundaries. But during Ragnarök, it would rise. Its body would twist through the sea with such violence that enormous waves would consume coastlines. Its venom would poison both sky and earth. Thor would meet the beast in one final battle. He would succeed in killing it. Then, after taking only 9 steps, the thunder god himself would collapse beneath its deadly poison. Victory and death arriving together. Once again, the lesson remained unmistakable. Heroism never guaranteed survival. Meanwhile, another prisoner would break free. Far to the north, beyond ordinary lands, the monstrous wolf Fenrir had been bound by the gods using a magical ribbon forged from impossible things. the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the spit of a bird. The imagination of Norse storytellers delighted in such paradoxes. Only something impossible could restrain something unstoppable. Yet every chain eventually weakens. At the appointed hour, Fenrir would tear himself loose. His jaws would stretch across heaven and earth. Fire blazed from his eyes. His howl alone would shake the 9 realms. Even Odin, the All-Father himself, could not avoid their final meeting. The old poems describe the scene with heartbreaking simplicity. Odin rode forward without hesitation. He knew exactly how the battle would end. Still, he advanced. Fenrir swallowed him whole. No miraculous rescue followed. No hidden victory reversed the tragedy. The king of the gods died because destiny required it. Only afterward did Odin's son, Vidar, avenge his father by tearing apart the great wolf's jaws. Throughout these stories runs an extraordinary thread. The Vikings never softened their myths to provide comfort. Even their greatest heroes failed. Even their wisest leaders suffered. Even divine power reached its limits. Perhaps that honesty explains why the legends endured. Life itself rarely grants perfect endings. Neither did Norse mythology. Loki, too, fulfilled the destiny long foretold. The clever trickster who had once aided the gods eventually became their greatest enemy. Freed from his punishment beneath the earth, he marched beside giants and monsters toward the final battlefield. There, friendships shattered. Old alliances dissolved. Everything familiar collapsed beneath the weight of unavoidable fate. One by one, the ancient powers fell. Tyr, Heimdall, Freyr, Thor, Odin. None escaped. The battlefield became silent. The heavens burned. The sea covered the land. For a moment, creation itself seemed to end. Yet this is where many modern retellings stop. The Vikings did not. Their prophecy contained something unexpectedly hopeful. After destruction came renewal. The waters receded. Fresh green fields emerged. The sun returned. A new generation of gods inherited the world. 2 human survivors, Leif and Leifthrazir, emerged from their hidden refuge beneath Yggdrasil to begin humanity anew. Life continued, changed forever, but continued nonetheless. This cycle of destruction followed by rebirth influenced Viking ritual more deeply than almost any other belief. Nothing truly ended. Everything transformed. The seed disappeared beneath frozen ground before becoming spring. The warrior entered the grave before reaching another hall. Even the universe itself would someday die, only to awaken again. Death and renewal became inseparable. It was precisely this understanding that shaped some of the most important seasonal ceremonies across Scandinavia. Every winter festival acknowledged that darkness never lasted forever. Every spring offering celebrated life returning from apparent death. The rituals mirrored the cosmos itself. They reminded humanity that endings often concealed beginnings invisible to ordinary eyes. Still, not everyone waited passively for destiny. Among the oldest legends were whispers of men and women who believed certain ceremonies could prepare their souls for the terrible days ahead. Not prevent Ragnarök. Nothing could. But ensure they would meet it without fear. Those preparations would lead deep into forests where sacred fires burned through the longest nights of the year, and where offerings unlike any made before would be placed before the gods beneath branches older than memory itself. The first snow rarely inspired fear. It arrived quietly, covering rooftops, fields, and forests beneath a clean white silence. Children welcomed it. Hunters welcomed it. Even farmers, exhausted after the autumn harvest, often greeted the season with relief. Winter had always been part of life in the north. What people feared was not the first snowfall. They feared the winter that refused to end. Every generation remembered at least one season when the cold lingered too long. The rivers remained frozen well into spring. Livestock weakened. Fishing became uncertain. The forests fell strangely quiet. When this happened, old stories returned with renewed strength. Perhaps Fimbulwinter had begun. Perhaps the gods were reminding humanity that nothing in the world remained permanent. Whether spoken seriously or half in jest, such thoughts reflected something deeper than superstition. The Vikings understood how fragile survival truly was. Unlike the kingdoms farther south, where long growing seasons offered multiple opportunities to recover from poor harvests, much of Scandinavia allowed little room for failure. One disastrous winter could erase decades of prosperity. Faith, therefore, became inseparable from preparation. As daylight shortened and the nights grew longer, villages across the north began preparing for one of the most important moments of the year: the great winter sacrifices. These ceremonies were not acts of panic, nor were they desperate attempts to bargain with the gods. They represented renewal, a promise between humanity and the unseen powers that had governed the changing seasons since time beyond memory. The Old Norse word most often associated with these gatherings was blot. Modern historians usually translate it simply as sacrifice. The original meaning carried greater depth. A bloat united the living. Families traveled for days through snow-covered valleys to reach the settlement where the ceremony would take place. Longhouses overflowed with visitors. Old disputes were settled before the ritual began. No community wished to approach the gods while divided against itself. Unity possessed spiritual importance. A fractured village weakened more than its own future. It threatened the balance upon which everyone depended. The preparations began several days before the ceremony. Ale brewed during the autumn harvest was brought from carefully sealed barrels. The healthiest livestock received special attention. Weapons were cleaned, not because battle was expected, but because every important gathering demanded respect. Children helped decorate the Great Hall with evergreen branches gathered from nearby forests. Unlike leaves that vanished with the first frost, evergreen trees remained alive throughout winter. They became natural symbols of endurance, life hidden beneath apparent death. The great feast came first. Tables filled with roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, dried fish, root vegetables preserved beneath the earth before the ground froze. Honey sweetened both food and drink whenever supplies allowed. The celebration was loud. Stories echoed through the hall. Laughter rose toward the smoke-darkened roof. Skalds recited ancient poems celebrating ancestors whose names continued living through memory alone. To an outsider, nothing about the evening appeared especially mysterious. It resembled countless other seasonal festivals celebrated throughout the ancient world. The atmosphere changed only after darkness settled completely outside. One by one, conversations grew quieter. Drinking horns were lowered. The musicians stopped playing. Attention shifted toward the center of the hall, where a stone basin rested beside the great fire. There, the oldest members of the community took their places. The chieftain, respected elders, sometimes a Gothi, a ritual leader responsible for guiding the ceremony. In other settlements, a Völva presided instead. Practices differed from region to region. The purpose remained the same: to renew the invisible bond between gods and humanity. Offerings varied according to circumstance. Most commonly, they consisted of animals carefully selected long before the ceremony. Horses, boars, goats, cattle, animals that represented both wealth and survival. Their sacrifice demanded genuine cost. Only meaningful gifts carried spiritual value. The offering itself unfolded with solemn precision. The animal was treated with remarkable respect. There was no celebration in the moment of death, no cruelty for its own sake. Its blood, believed to contain the force of life itself, was collected inside the stone basin. Bundles of evergreen branches were then dipped into the blood before gently sprinkling it upon important places throughout the hall. The walls, the carved pillars supporting the roof, the ceremonial altar, the gathered participants, even the tools used throughout the coming year. To modernize, such customs may appear unsettling. To the Vikings, they represented blessing, life sharing its strength with life. The Old Norse language even preserved a specific term for this ritual sprinkling. The blood was not wasted, neither was the animal. After the ceremony concluded, its meat became part of the communal feast. The offering nourished both the gods through ritual and the people through shared food. Nothing meaningful was discarded. Everything participated in the same sacred exchange. Several medieval writers described these ceremonies after Christianity spread across Scandinavia. Some accounts portrayed them with horror. Others exaggerated details to emphasize the contrast between old beliefs and the new faith. As always, separating observation from religious bias remains difficult. Yet archaeology supports the existence of large communal feasting halls, where ritual and celebration clearly intertwined. Massive quantities of animal bones have been uncovered at several ceremonial sites. Many display patterns suggesting organized seasonal gatherings rather than ordinary meals. The evidence reveals communities coming together with remarkable regularity around shared acts of worship. Most bloats focused upon gratitude and prosperity. A successful harvest, healthy children, safe voyages, protection during the coming winter. Yet history also preserves whispers of ceremonies performed only under extraordinary circumstances, when ordinary offerings no longer seemed sufficient. These darker traditions remain among the most controversial subjects in Viking studies. Several medieval chroniclers claimed that, during times of severe crisis, human sacrifice occasionally occurred. Famines, plagues, military disasters, moments when entire kingdoms believed their survival balanced upon a knife's edge. One of the best-known accounts comes from the temple at Uppsala, where Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described elaborate sacrifices held every 9 years. According to his report, animals and humans alike were offered before the sacred grove beside the temple. The bodies were then hung among the trees. Modern historians continue debating how much of Adam's description reflects reliable information and how much reflects hearsay or religious hostility. He never witnessed the ceremonies personally. He relied upon second-hand reports gathered after Christianity had already begun transforming Scandinavia. Even so, archaeology has uncovered evidence suggesting that ritual human sacrifice may indeed have occurred in at least some locations during the Viking Age and earlier Germanic periods. The truth remains uncertain. What is certain is that such events, if they occurred at all, were exceptionally rare. They belong to moments of overwhelming desperation rather than ordinary religious life. Yet rarity often strengthens legend. A single extraordinary event may survive in memory far longer than 1,000 ordinary ceremonies. The old storytellers understood this. As generations passed, tales surrounding these sacrifices grew increasingly mysterious. Some claimed volunteers stepped forward willingly, believing they would carry the prayers of the living directly to the gods. Others insisted kings occasionally offered themselves when every other sacrifice had failed. One legend tells of a ruler who watched his kingdom wither beneath 3 consecutive years of failed harvests. The rivers shrank. The forests produced almost no game. Children died before reaching adulthood. The people blamed neither laziness nor poor planning. They believed the favor of the gods had faded. Desperate to save his kingdom, the aging ruler gathered his people within the sacred grove. There, before the oldest trees anyone could remember, he surrendered his own life so that the land itself might live. Whether the tale preserves genuine history or later myth hardly matters. Its message echoes through Norse literature again and again. A true leader accepted responsibility for the fate of the community, even when that responsibility demanded everything. Perhaps this explains why Odin's own sacrifice remains such a powerful example. The greatest authority willingly endured suffering for wisdom. The greatest king willingly accepted death for his people. Power existed to serve, not merely to command. As midnight approached, the fires within the sacred grove burned lower. Their light flickered across towering trunks blackened by centuries of smoke and weather. The wind carried the scent of pine resin through the darkness. No birds sang. No animals approached. Only the steady crackle of burning wood disturbed the silence. It was then, according to the oldest traditions, that the boundary between offering and prophecy became almost impossible to distinguish. The flames themselves were watched with extraordinary care. The direction of rising smoke, the sound made by splitting timber, the shape of glowing embers collapsing into ash. Nothing occurred without meaning. The gods, many believed, answered in patterns rather than words. Those who knew how to look could read messages hidden within ordinary fire. And among all the people gathered around those ancient flames, none watched more carefully than the Völva, for she believed that before dawn, the fire would reveal not merely the fate of one village or one kingdom, but the first shadow of a destiny already moving silently across all 9 realms. The fire had burned for hours before anyone claimed to see a sign. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The flames rose and fell with the rhythm of the wind, consuming logs gathered from sacred groves earlier that day. Sparks drifted upward into the night, disappearing among countless stars that stretched across the northern sky. The villagers waited. No one hurried the silence. Patience was itself a form of devotion. The oldest among them believed the gods never spoke to those who demanded immediate answers. They revealed themselves only to those willing to listen. The Völva remained seated beside the fire, her carved staff resting across her lap. She never stared directly into the flames. Instead, her gaze drifted slightly beyond them, as though watching something hidden behind the fire rather than the fire itself. The distinction appeared insignificant. To those gathered around her, it meant everything. A true seer did not merely observe what ordinary eyes could see. She searched for the shape beneath appearances, the pattern beneath movement, the truth beneath light. Gradually, the hall grew so quiet that individual sounds became impossible to ignore. A log settled deeper into the fire. Snow slipped from the roof outside. Someone shifted their weight against the wooden wall. The distant cry of a raven echoed somewhere beyond the trees. Every sound seemed strangely amplified. Every heartbeat seemed louder than before. Then the Völva lifted her hand. No words, only a single movement. The gathering understood immediately. Something had changed. She reached forward and picked up a handful of pale herbs that had rested untouched beside the hearth throughout the evening. One by one, she scattered them into the flames. A fragrant smoke curled upward. Unlike the heavy scent of burning pine, this smoke carried hints of juniper, mugwort, yarrow, and wild plants gathered from mountain slopes during the short northern summer. Many of these herbs possessed genuine medicinal properties. Others held ceremonial importance that has long since been forgotten. Together, they transformed the atmosphere inside the hall. The air grew thicker, softer, almost dreamlike. Modern science recognizes that repetitive chanting, controlled breathing, flickering firelight, and aromatic smoke can alter human perception. The Vikings, of course, explained the experience differently. They believed the veil separating worlds had begun to thin. No one spoke. Even the children sensed that ordinary conversation no longer belonged in that place. The Völva closed her eyes. A single woman standing behind her began to sing. The melody was unlike the songs heard during feasts. It rose slowly. Each note lingered before fading into the next. Soon, another voice joined, then another, until the entire hall breathed through music that seemed older than language itself. Centuries later, Icelandic texts would describe ritual songs known as varðlokkur, chants believed to call helpful spirits toward the ceremony. No one knows precisely how those melodies sounded. Their music vanished long before anyone attempted to preserve it. Only their purpose survives: to invite, not command; to welcome, not control. The distinction reflected an important aspect of Norse belief. Powerful forces were never treated as servants. They were approached with humility. Respect created harmony. Arrogance invited disaster. The singing continued. Minutes became difficult to measure. Some listeners later claimed the firelight no longer cast ordinary shadows. Others remembered the smoke moving against the wind inside the hall. A few insisted they briefly recognized familiar faces among the darkness between the wooden pillars. Parents, friends, ancestors. Gone for many years, yet somehow present again, for only an instant. Whether such visions arose from faith, exhaustion, or imagination remains impossible to determine. Human memory has always transformed extraordinary moments into stories. Stories in turn become tradition. Tradition eventually becomes history's greatest mystery. The Völva finally spoke. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. The fire remembers. Nothing more. No explanation followed. Those gathered waited. She reached toward the embers with the tip of her staff, carefully separating several glowing pieces of charcoal until they formed an unfamiliar pattern upon the stone hearth. To everyone else, the arrangement appeared random. To her, it resembled something meaningful. She studied it for a long time. Then she began asking questions, not to the villagers, to the fire itself. Old Norse tradition occasionally portrayed wisdom as something uncovered through dialogue rather than command. Questions invited revelation. Commands closed the mind. The questions themselves have been lost. Perhaps they concerned the coming harvest. Perhaps the safety of ships preparing to sail in spring. Perhaps something far greater. Only fragments survive. Enough to suggest that every answer required interpretation rather than certainty. The future never arrived as a complete picture. It emerged through symbols. A branch burning more slowly than expected. An ember refusing to die. Smoke twisting toward the northern door. Each detail became another thread within an invisible tapestry. This way of understanding prophecy shaped Viking decision-making more profoundly than many modern people realize. The gods did not remove uncertainty. They taught humanity how to live with it. That lesson demanded constant observation. No sign existed alone. A dream confirmed by the flight of ravens carried greater weight. A prophecy strengthened by unusual weather became harder to ignore. Every omen gathered meaning through relationship with others. Life itself resembled a web. Pull one strand, the entire pattern shifted. Perhaps no image represented this philosophy better than the Norns. Far beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, according to Norse tradition, lived three mysterious women. Urð, Verðandi, Skuld. They were not ordinary goddesses. Even Odin respected their authority. Day and night, they tended the roots of the world tree, drawing sacred water from the well of Urðr to prevent creation itself from withering. More importantly, they wove the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Past, present, future, not separate, intertwined. Every newborn entered the world carrying a thread already connected to countless others. Every decision altered its path, yet no one could entirely escape the greater design. The Völur often invoked the Norns during ceremonies seeking guidance, not because destiny could easily be changed, but because understanding destiny offered its own form of strength. A sailor warned of storms, prepared his ship more carefully. A king, foreseeing war, strengthened alliances. Knowledge rarely prevented hardship. It allowed people to meet hardship with open eyes. This quiet acceptance distinguished Norse spirituality from many neighboring traditions. Hope existed, but it never depended upon false certainty. The ceremony continued deep into the night. Outside, snow drifted silently across the frozen fields. The stars wheeled overhead with patient indifference. Inside, The final logs collapsed into glowing embers. One by one, villagers departed in respectful silence. Some carried comfort. Others carried questions that would remain unanswered for years. The Völva stayed behind, alone. Only the dying fire illuminated the hall. She placed another small bundle of herbs into the embers. This time, no one remained to witness what followed. Only later did stories begin to spread. A shepherd claimed he saw pale blue light shining through the smoke hole long after midnight. A fisherman returning before dawn insisted he heard voices singing from inside the empty hall, despite knowing everyone had already gone home. Another swore that 2 ravens remained perched upon the roof until sunrise without moving once. Perhaps they imagined these things. Perhaps memory embroidered ordinary events until they became extraordinary. Or perhaps certain moments truly resisted ordinary explanation. The Vikings themselves offered no single answer. They simply preserved the stories. Generations later, those stories merged with another belief that spread across the north. A belief that did not concern prophecy, or sacrifice, or even death. It concerned transformation. For among the fiercest warriors who ever sailed beneath dragon-headed banners were men who claimed that, for a few terrifying moments before battle, they ceased to be entirely human. The sagas gave them a name that would echo through history: the Berserkers. Few figures from the Viking Age have inspired more fascination than the Berserkers. For centuries, travelers described them with equal measures of admiration and fear. Kings sought them, enemies dreaded them. Even experienced warriors preferred not to stand beside them unless absolutely necessary. The stories seemed almost impossible to believe. Men who charged into battle without armor. Warriors who laughed when struck by swords. Fighters who appeared untouched by pain. Some claimed they possessed the strength of bears. Others insisted wolves fought beside them. The truth, as with so many parts of Viking history, lies somewhere between documented reality and enduring legend. The word berserker has been interpreted in different ways by scholars. Some believe it means bear shirt, referring to warriors who wore the hides of great bears. Others argue that it originally meant bear shirt, describing men who entered combat with little or no armor. Either explanation captures only part of their mystery. To the Vikings themselves, a berserker represented far more than an unusually fierce soldier. He embodied transformation, the ability to leave ordinary humanity behind for a brief and terrifying moment. Stories about berserkers appear throughout the Icelandic sagas. They are rarely described as evil. Neither are they portrayed as ordinary heroes. Instead, they exist somewhere between civilization and wilderness. Useful during war, dangerous during peace. Many kings welcomed berserkers into their service because their fearlessness could shatter enemy formations. The same kings often struggled to control them once the battle ended. The old stories repeatedly warned that a berserker's fury did not always disappear when the fighting stopped. Some wandered through villages still gripped by uncontrollable rage. Others collapsed into profound exhaustion, sleeping for an entire day after combat finally ended. Modern historians have proposed countless explanations. Some suggest carefully prepared herbal mixtures. Others point toward psychological conditioning, ritualized breathing, or extreme emotional training. No single theory answers every question. Perhaps different groups achieved similar effects through different methods. Whatever the explanation, the rituals surrounding these warriors deserve as much attention as the battles themselves. A berserker was not created overnight. According to later traditions, the path began in isolation. Young candidates spent long periods living beyond ordinary settlements. Some stayed deep within forests. Others wandered mountains where only hunters normally traveled. There they learned patience before learning violence, silence before learning battle cries. The wilderness itself became their first teacher. The North offered constant lessons. A wolf survived not through endless aggression, but through discipline. A bear, spent months conserving strength before unleashing overwhelming power. Ravens waited with remarkable intelligence before claiming the battlefield. Nature rewarded those who understood rhythm rather than constant force. Many old legends claim aspiring berserkers carefully observed these animals, not merely to imitate them, to understand them. Some traditions even suggest they believed every great predator possessed a spirit that could, under extraordinary circumstances, share its strength with a worthy human. Such beliefs were hardly unique to Scandinavia. Across countless ancient cultures, hunters respected the creatures they pursued. The Vikings expressed that respect through stories of transformation. Whether symbolic or literal, depended entirely upon the listener. When the period of solitude ended, the candidate returned carrying little more than practical clothing, a weapon, and whatever wisdom the wilderness had granted. The true instruction then began. Unlike ordinary warriors, berserkers trained not simply to strengthen their bodies. They sought mastery over fear itself. Older fighters deliberately placed younger men in situations designed to test composure, standing motionless while icy rivers surged around them, remaining awake through long winter nights, holding burning branches until pain became impossible to ignore, running across frozen hills until exhaustion erased every unnecessary thought. These exercises sound brutal. They almost certainly were. Yet beneath their severity lay a recognizable purpose. The candidate learned that fear arrived before danger. Pain arrived before injury. The mind often surrendered long before the body truly failed. Only by confronting these limits repeatedly could a warrior hope to remain calm amid genuine chaos. The sagas often describe experienced berserkers sitting quietly before battle, while ordinary soldiers sharpened weapons and whispered nervous prayers. Their calm appeared unsettling. Some smiled, some closed their eyes. Others stared toward the horizon without speaking for hours. The silence formed part of the ritual. No one interrupted them. Even kings understood that the transformation demanded complete concentration. Several traditions describe ceremonies taking place shortly before dawn. A fire burned low. Animal hides covered the frozen ground. The chosen warriors formed a circle around the flames. There, beneath skies still crowded with stars, they began chanting. The words differed from region to region. No complete version survives, yet their rhythm appears consistently throughout the literature. Slow, steady, repetitive. Every voice synchronized with breathing. Every breath synchronized with the beating of drums or the striking of wooden staffs against the earth. Modern researchers recognize similar techniques in numerous warrior traditions throughout history. Controlled rhythm alters the body's response to stress. It narrows attention. It sharpens focus. The Vikings interpreted the experience differently. They believed another presence gradually awakened within them. Not a separate soul. Not possession. Something older. Something shared between humanity and the untamed world. The bear became the most powerful symbol of this transformation. Few animals commanded greater respect in the north. A full-grown brown bear towered over any man. It survived brutal winters, defended its territory without hesitation, displayed astonishing strength when threatened. To wear a bear's skin therefore carried immense symbolic meaning. The hide did not magically transform its owner. It reminded him of the qualities he sought to embody: patience, power, endurance, unshakable resolve. Other groups favored wolves. Unlike bears, wolves relied upon cooperation. Each understood its place within the pack. Each trusted the others completely during the hunt. A warrior wearing wolfskin declared loyalty not merely to his leader, but to the men fighting beside him. Together, these symbols created identities extending beyond individual personalities. The ordinary farmer disappeared. The fisherman vanished. The craftsman ceased to exist. For a few hours, only the warrior remained. One saga describes an aging berserker explaining the experience to a curious boy. He compared it to standing upon the shoreline during a violent storm. The sea did not become calmer. The sailor simply stopped resisting its rhythm. Whether those exact words were ever spoken cannot be known. Their meaning reflects Norse philosophy remarkably well. Mastery rarely meant domination. It meant harmony with forces greater than oneself. Not every account, however, presents berserkers in heroic terms. Some stories portray them as deeply tragic figures. The transformation that granted such extraordinary courage also isolated them from ordinary society. Many struggled to return completely to peaceful life. Families feared sudden bursts of anger. Neighbors remained cautious. Children admired them from a distance, but seldom approached. Strength always demanded a price. This idea appears repeatedly throughout Norse mythology. Odin surrendered an eye. Tyr sacrificed his hand. Thor accepted the certainty of his own death. Every great gift required equally great cost. The berserkers fit naturally within that pattern. Perhaps the most mysterious aspect of their tradition concerns what happened immediately before battle. Several sagas describe warriors biting the rims of their shields until wood splintered beneath their teeth. Others mention trembling so violently that observers mistook fear for weakness. Then, almost instantly, the trembling ceased. The shaking transformed into explosive movement. Battle cries erupted across the valley. The charge began. Modern medicine offers several possible explanations. Adrenaline, extreme emotional arousal. Psychological conditioning, ancient ritual. No single answer excludes the others. History often refuses simple categories. What mattered to the Vikings was not chemical processes inside the body. What mattered was courage made visible. Enemies watching such warriors advance often broke formation before swords even met. Fear itself became a weapon, yet victory carried consequences beyond the battlefield. When the fighting ended, surviving berserkers frequently withdrew from celebration. While others shared stories around great fires, these men often walked alone beneath dark forests or sat silently beside rivers until sunrise. Perhaps they sought peace. Perhaps they thanked the spirits they believed had fought beside them. Or perhaps they simply struggled to become ordinary men once again. The sagas never fully explain. They merely describe the silence. As Christianity gradually spread across Scandinavia, attitudes toward berserkers changed dramatically. The church viewed many of their rituals with deep suspicion. Royal authority increasingly favored disciplined armies over unpredictable champions. By the 11th century, organized bands of berserkers had largely disappeared from historical records. The men vanished. The legends remained. Even today, the word berserk survives in everyday language, carrying only a faint echo of its remarkable origins. Yet hidden beneath those familiar stories lies another mystery, one even older than the berserkers themselves. For neither seers nor warriors occupied the holiest places in the Viking world. Those belonged to the forests, to the springs, to the silent groves where no house was ever built, no tree willingly cut, and where generations believed the gods themselves still walked unseen beneath ancient branches. Long before great halls rose beside the fjords, before kings gathered warriors beneath carved wooden roofs, the forests had already become places of reverence. The trees were older than memory. Some had stood for centuries before the first longship ever touched the sea. Others had witnessed generations come and go without changing in any visible way. To the Vikings, such endurance carried meaning. Anything capable of surviving countless winters deserved respect. Anything that appeared older than human history invited wonder. It is therefore no surprise that many of the oldest sacred places in Scandinavia were not temples built by human hands. They were landscapes, a spring emerging from solid rock, a ring of towering oaks untouched by axes, a narrow valley where the wind seemed strangely absent, an island hidden within a mist-covered lake. Nature itself became the sanctuary. Unlike later religions, which often separated the sacred from the ordinary through walls and architecture, Norse belief allowed the divine to remain exactly where it had always been, beneath open skies, among roots and rivers. Within the silence of untouched wilderness, several medieval writers describe sacred groves where no tree could be cut without inviting disaster. Even collecting fallen branches sometimes required permission from those responsible for maintaining the site. Whether these restrictions arose from religious belief, practical conservation, or both, they reveal a remarkable relationship between the Vikings and their environment. The forest was never merely a source of timber. It possessed its own dignity. Archaeology has strengthened this impression. Across Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, researchers have uncovered ritual deposits hidden in lakes, bogs, and woodland clearings. Weapons intentionally bent before being submerged beneath dark water. Jewelry buried where no settlement ever existed. Animal bones arranged with unmistakable care. Wooden idols placed deep within wetlands where no ordinary traveler would ever discover them. These objects remained untouched for centuries. They were never meant to be recovered. They had already reached their destination. To modern observers, a lake is simply water. To the Vikings, still water often represented a boundary, a mirror between worlds. Its surface reflected the sky above while concealing unknown depths below. Standing beside such places at dawn or twilight, it is easy to understand why ancient people imagined another realm lying just beyond ordinary sight. Mist drifted across the water. The shoreline disappeared. Birdsong echoed from unseen trees. The familiar world briefly transformed into something mysterious. Many offerings found in bogs and lakes date back long before the Viking Age. Generation after generation continued placing valuable objects beneath the water. The tradition endured because each generation inherited not only land but memory. Every child grew up hearing which spring should never be polluted, which grove remained forbidden after sunset, which hill belonged to forgotten ancestors. Stories preserved geography. Geography preserved belief. One remarkable account tells of a traveler who unknowingly entered a sacred grove while searching for shelter during a snowstorm. The forest appeared perfectly ordinary. Tall pines, fresh snow, silent branches bending beneath their icy burden. Only after gathering firewood did he notice something unusual. Every tree surrounding him bore small carvings made long ago, not elaborate images, only simple runes, some nearly erased by weather, others still sharp despite countless winters. He suddenly realized that not one tree had been cut. Dead branches covered the ground everywhere, yet none had ever been collected. The realization filled him with unease. He left immediately, abandoning the wood where it lay. According to the legend, he survived the storm. His companion, who laughed at the warnings and carried the wood home, reportedly suffered misfortune throughout the following year. Whether the tale reflected genuine belief or served as a cautionary lesson, its purpose remained clear. Respect places you do not understand. This attitude appears repeatedly throughout Norse tradition. The greatest dangers rarely announced themselves with violence. They waited patiently for arrogance. The Vikings admired courage. They had little admiration for recklessness. Perhaps nowhere did this philosophy become more visible than around sacred springs. Fresh water determined the survival of every settlement. Without clean springs, villages simply could not exist. Yet some sources describe wells treated with extraordinary reverence far beyond their practical importance. Coins, beads, animal bones, small weapons, fragments of precious metal. These offerings accumulated over centuries. The spring became more than a source of water. It became a place where promises were made. Children received blessings. Travelers prayed before long voyages. Families thanked the gods after difficult winters. Even today, archaeologists continue discovering ritual deposits beneath ancient springs throughout northern Europe. many remain impossible to explain through ordinary daily activity. The Vikings seemed remarkably willing to surrender valuable possessions if they believed doing so strengthened the invisible harmony, connecting humanity with the divine. Not every sacred place welcomed large gatherings. Some remained known only to a handful of individuals. The Völur often traveled to such places alone. The oldest sagas occasionally describe hidden clearings reached only after hours of walking through dense forest. No paths marked the way. No monuments identified the location. Only memory guided those who sought them. Within these secluded spaces stood simple arrangements of stones blackened by ancient fires. Weathered wooden posts leaned beneath moss. Animal skulls, long since whitened by rain and sunlight, rested quietly beneath towering branches. Nothing appeared magnificent. Everything appeared old. Age itself became sacred. The farther something reached into the past, the closer it seemed to the beginning of creation. Several later Christian writers interpreted these places as sites of dark worship. Their descriptions often reflected genuine discomfort. Coming from traditions centered upon churches and written scripture, they struggled to understand religions rooted primarily in landscape and oral memory. To them, the forests appeared empty. To the Vikings, they were full. Every rustling branch, every distant bird, every unexpected silence. The woods constantly reminded visitors that humanity occupied only a small corner of a much larger living world. That feeling persists even now. Anyone who has walked alone through an ancient forest before sunrise knows the peculiar sensation of being observed despite seeing no one. The Vikings simply gave that feeling a spiritual language. They believed unseen presences shared those woods. Land spirits, ancestors, perhaps even gods wandering in disguise. One should therefore behave with humility. Many hunters spoke softly before entering unfamiliar forests. Some left small gifts beneath remarkable trees. Others greeted isolated springs as though acknowledging an unseen host. Such customs may appear unusual today, yet similar traditions have existed across countless cultures throughout history. Respecting the landscape often became another way of respecting life itself. Among the most mysterious discoveries made by archaeologists are dozens of weapons recovered from Scandinavian bogs, thousands of swords, spears, shields, arrowheads. Some belong to defeated armies. Others appear to have been deliberately destroyed before entering the water. The scale astonishes even modern researchers. Entire collections of military equipment vanished beneath marshes without any practical reason. Most scholars believe these deposits formed enormous ritual offerings following important victories. Rather than dividing every weapon among the victors, communities surrendered a portion to the gods. Success demanded gratitude. Victory carried obligation. The greatest achievements belonged not only to human effort, but also to divine favor. This belief prevented triumph from becoming arrogance. Even conquest required humility. As centuries passed, these sacred landscapes accumulated countless stories. Children heard them beside winter fires. Travelers repeated them across distant kingdoms. Some stories contradicted one another. Others merged into new legends. One tale spoke of a grove where ravens never landed. Another described a lake that reflected stars even beneath heavy clouds. A third claimed a spring continued flowing warm during the coldest winters. No historian can verify such accounts. Neither can history completely erase them. Legends survive because they preserve emotional truth, even when factual certainty disappears. They remind us how ancient people experienced the world, rather than merely describing it. Among all these whispered traditions, however, one place appeared again and again. Always at the edge of maps, always beyond familiar roads. A forest so old that even the oldest Völur claimed its first trees had sprouted before Odin hung upon Yggdrasil. Its true name has never survived. The sagas refer to it only as the Silent Grove. Few entered willingly. fewer still returned with stories. Those who did rarely agreed on what they had witnessed. Some remembered hearing voices carried by the wind. Others insisted they encountered no one at all. Yet every account ended the same way. Each traveler emerged convinced that something deep within the forest had been quietly watching from the moment they crossed beneath its ancient branches. And according to the oldest whispers preserved in the north, it was there, within the heart of the silent grove, that the final and most secret rituals of the Völur were performed, hidden from kings, hidden from warriors, and hidden even from most of those who still honored the old gods. No map ever revealed the path to the silent grove, not because the Vikings lacked the skill to draw one, but because they believed some places could only be found when the moment itself allowed it. A road marked upon parchment invited anyone to follow. A sacred path demanded something different: memory, patience, permission. The oldest traditions insisted that no one simply decided to visit the grove. The grove called first, perhaps through a recurring dream, perhaps through a raven that refused to leave the roof of a particular home, perhaps through an uneasiness that lingered without explanation for weeks or even months. Only then would a Völva quietly prepare for the journey. She did not announce her destination. She did not gather companions. Whatever awaited within the ancient forest was meant to be approached without witnesses. Many later legends exaggerated these journeys into tales of impossible magic. The surviving evidence suggests something far more restrained, far more human. The Völva traveled alone because solitude sharpened attention, conversation distracted, silence revealed. Each step carried her farther from ordinary life. The sounds of livestock disappeared first, then the distant rhythm of axes striking wood. Eventually, even the familiar songs of village birds faded behind unfamiliar voices deeper within the forest. The air itself seemed different, cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old pine resin. Towering trunks blocked much of the sunlight, allowing only narrow columns of gold to reach the moss-covered ground. Time behaved strangely beneath such forests. Morning resembled evening. Midday resembled dawn. Without the sun clearly visible, hours lost much of their certainty. Perhaps that is why so many ancient cultures imagined sacred forests existing beyond ordinary time. One walked only a short distance, yet emerged feeling as though an entire season had quietly passed. The Vikings respected this sensation rather than fearing it. The world contained places where human measures no longer mattered. Near the heart of the grove stood no magnificent temple, no towering statue, no throne for kings. Instead, the oldest stories describe a simple circle of weathered stones surrounding a massive ash tree whose roots disappeared into darkness beneath the earth. No one knew how old the tree truly was. Each generation believed it had always existed. Children grew into grandparents. Grandparents became ancestors. Still, the tree remained. Whether such a place ever existed exactly as described cannot be known. Yet archaeology repeatedly reminds us that prehistoric Scandinavia contained ceremonial stone circles, sacred trees, and ritual gathering places long before the Viking Age. The legends likely preserved echoes of landscapes that once shaped countless lives. Upon reaching the ash tree, the Völva performed no dramatic ceremony. She waited. Waiting formed the first ritual. No prayer, no chanting, no offering, only stillness. Modern life often mistakes stillness for inactivity. The ancient North understood it differently. Silence allowed the world to speak. Gradually, ordinary sounds returned. Wind passing through needles high above. Water dripping from unseen branches. A distant woodpecker striking hollow bark. Every sound occupied its proper place. Only after the forest settled around her did the Völva remove a small leather pouch hanging beneath her cloak. Inside rested objects gathered over many years. Tiny bones carved with runes, smooth river stones, fragments of amber, sprigs of dried herbs. Each item carried memory. None possessed value because of rarity. Their worth came from experience. A particular stone collected after surviving a violent storm. A feather discovered beside an ancient burial mound. A piece of antler inherited from another Völva who had long since passed into memory. Objects become meaningful because lives become attached to them. The Vikings understood this instinctively. One by one, she arranged them upon the ground. Not randomly. Patterns mattered. The relationship between one object and another often carried greater meaning than the objects themselves. The circle slowly expanded beneath the tree. Amber beside bone, stone beside feather, wood beside iron. Earthly things balanced against one another. Many scholars believe such symbolic arrangements reflected the Norse fascination with order emerging from apparent chaos. The cosmos itself functioned through relationships. Gods, giants, humans, animals, the living, the dead. None existed entirely alone. Everything influenced everything else. This same philosophy appears throughout Norse mythology. Even Yggdrasil connected realms that otherwise seemed impossibly distant. The ceremony unfolding beneath the ash tree mirrored that greater pattern. The small reflected the immense. When the arrangement finally felt complete, the Völva reached for the object she carried more carefully than any other. Her staff. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover elaborate staffs buried beside several women believed to have held ritual importance. Iron shafts, bronze fittings, beautifully crafted handles. Their exact purpose remains debated. Walking support, symbol of authority, ceremonial instrument, perhaps all three. Whatever their practical function, the staff became inseparable from the image of the Völva. It represented guidance rather than force, direction rather than domination. She pressed its tip gently into the earth, not striking, not commanding, simply touching. The gesture acknowledged the ground beneath her feet. Every ceremony began with the same recognition. Human beings belonged to the land long before they attempted to shape it. The chants that followed differed from every song heard elsewhere. No audience listened. No villagers joined their voices. Only the forest answered. The words themselves have vanished forever. Language changes. Melodies disappear. Meaning survives. The surviving descriptions suggest the chants resembled conversations more than declarations. Questions drifted into silence. Silence slowly offered response. Not through spoken words, through awareness. A branch falling unexpectedly. The sudden arrival of mist. The appearance of a deer watching quietly from between distant trees. Nothing forced interpretation. Everything invited reflection. This subtle approach distinguished Norse ritual from many modern assumptions about ancient religion. The goal was rarely to control nature. It was to understand one's place within it. During one such ceremony, according to a legend preserved in Western Iceland centuries later, a young apprentice secretly followed her teacher into the silent grove. She believed years of instruction entitled her to witness the hidden ritual. Keeping well behind the older woman, she moved carefully through the trees without revealing herself. The ceremony unfolded exactly as expected. The Völva arranged her sacred objects, placed her staff against the earth, began chanting softly. Nothing extraordinary appeared to happen. The apprentice nearly laughed at her own disappointment. Then she noticed the birds. There were none. Not one. An entire forest had become perfectly silent. No wings, no insects, no movement among the branches. Even the wind seemed unwilling to cross the clearing. The silence itself became overwhelming. Instinct urged her to run. Instead, she remained frozen behind a fallen tree. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. Then the Völva quietly turned toward the place where the apprentice hid. She never opened her eyes. Yet she spoke directly to the unseen observer. "You have forgotten the first lesson." The apprentice stepped into the clearing, trembling. I made no sound. The older woman nodded gently. I know. Then how did you know I was here? The vulva smiled. Because the forest became too quiet. According to the legend, she explained that true silence never belonged to nature. A healthy forest always breathed. Birds sang. Leaves moved. Animals searched for food. When every sound vanished together, something had disturbed the balance. Not spirits, not monsters, simply another human presence. The apprentice remembered that lesson for the rest of her life. So did those who later repeated the story. Wisdom began with observation, not with miracles. The journey back from the silent grove always took longer than the journey inward. The Völur never hurried their return. Whatever insights emerged beneath the ancient ash tree required careful thought before entering the ordinary world again. Not every vision demanded action. Not every warning required immediate announcement. Knowing when to remain silent often proved just as important as knowing when to speak. This restraint earned the respect of many chieftains. Unlike fortune tellers promising certainty, the Völur rarely claimed absolute knowledge. They offered possibilities, patterns, directions. The future remained alive because human choices still mattered. Even fate left room for character. As years passed, however, another force quietly entered Scandinavia. Not through invasion, not through conquest, but through travelers, merchants, missionaries, men carrying unfamiliar symbols carved not upon wood or stone, but bound inside carefully written books. With them came a new understanding of the sacred, a new understanding of truth, and a growing conviction that the old forests, the ancient groves, and the rituals preserved beneath their branches belonged not to wisdom, but to a fading age whose final twilight had already begun. The first crosses did not arrive with armies. They arrived aboard trading ships. Long before Scandinavian kings accepted Christianity, Viking merchants had already visited Christian kingdoms for generations. They traded furs for silk, amber for silver, iron for finely crafted glass. Every voyage carried more than goods. Ideas traveled just as easily as cargo. A merchant returning from England might bring home an unfamiliar prayer. A traveler from the Frankish kingdoms might describe churches built from stone instead of timber. Someone who had served in the distant city of Constantinople could spend entire winters telling stories about glittering cathedrals whose golden ceilings reflected thousands of candle flames. At first, these stories inspired curiosity rather than conflict. The Vikings had always encountered foreign gods. When they reached Ireland, they found monasteries. When they sailed the rivers of Eastern Europe, they met Muslim traders. When they served as warriors in the Byzantine Empire, they prayed beside Christians from every corner of Europe. The world proved far larger than any single belief. For many Scandinavians, another god simply became another mystery. Few imagined that the old traditions themselves might one day disappear. Change came gradually, almost invisibly. A small wooden cross hanging beside Thor's hammer. A family choosing Christian burial while still celebrating the old winter feast. A king allowing missionaries to preach within his lands without forcing anyone to listen. Old customs and new beliefs existed beside one another for decades, sometimes for generations. The transition rarely resembled the dramatic moments later legends preferred to remember. It unfolded through ordinary lives. Children grew up hearing two different explanations for the same sunrise. Two different prayers before the evening meal. Two different understandings of death. History often changes this way, quietly. One generation hardly notices. The next can scarcely imagine the world that came before. For the Völur, however, these changes carried profound consequences. Their knowledge had never been written into sacred books. It survived through memory, through apprenticeship, through songs passed from one voice to another. When fewer young people chose to learn those traditions, entire branches of ancient knowledge simply faded away. No fire destroyed them. No conqueror stole them. They vanished because no one remained to remember every word. This quiet disappearance may be the greatest loss in Viking history, not because forgotten rituals possessed supernatural power, but because they represented unique ways of understanding the relationship between humanity and nature. The last Völur stood at the edge of two worlds. Behind them stretched centuries of oral tradition. Ahead lay a future increasingly shaped by written scripture. The old songs grew softer with every passing winter. Several Icelandic sagas preserve remarkable stories from this period of transition. They describe elderly seers living quietly on isolated farms, respected by neighbors who no longer fully shared their beliefs. People still sought their advice before dangerous voyages. They still interpreted unusual dreams. They still remembered ancient genealogies stretching back generations. Yet something had changed. Their authority no longer rested upon certainty. It rested upon memory. They had become living echoes of another age. One story tells of a young priest visiting an elderly vulva shortly before her death. Expecting confrontation, he instead found unexpected kindness. The old woman welcomed him inside her modest home. She offered warm food. She listened patiently as he spoke about his faith. When he finished, she simply nodded. "The world has room for many paths," she reportedly said, "but every path eventually becomes an old road." Whether those exact words were ever spoken cannot be known. They survive because they express something history repeatedly demonstrates. Every civilization believes its present will last forever. None ever does. The Vikings themselves understood impermanence better than most. Even the gods faced Ragnarök. Why should human traditions prove any different? As Christianity spread across Scandinavia, many sacred groves gradually disappeared. Some were cut down deliberately. Others slowly returned to ordinary woodland as memories faded. Wooden temples fell into ruin. Burial customs changed. Ship graves became increasingly rare. Runestones began carrying crosses beside ancient carvings. Old festivals acquired new meanings while quietly preserving older rhythms beneath their surface. Even today, traces remain. Midwinter celebrations, bonfires, evergreen decorations. Ancient customs often survive by adapting rather than resisting. History rarely erases everything. It layers one tradition upon another until both become difficult to separate. Archaeology continues uncovering remarkable evidence of this transition. Some graves contain both Christian crosses and Thor's hammer pendants. Others reveal traditional Viking burial practices alongside unmistakably Christian symbols. These discoveries remind us that real people seldom abandon lifelong beliefs overnight. Identity changes slowly. Families negotiate. Communities compromise. Faith evolves. The past lingers. One remarkable discovery in Sweden revealed a small silver pendant shaped like a hammer. At first glance, it appeared completely traditional. Closer examination revealed something unexpected. The lower portion subtly resembled a Christian cross. Whether the craftsman intended to unite both symbols or simply experimented with artistic design remains unknown. Yet the object perfectly captures the world in which it was created. A world standing between two eras, neither entirely old nor entirely new. As literacy spread, another transformation occurred. Stories once preserved only through memory finally reached parchment. The great Icelandic sagas, the poetic Edda, the prose Edda. Without Christian scribes recording these works centuries later, much of Norse mythology would have vanished forever. Ironically, the people who replaced the old religion also preserved many of its greatest stories. History delights in such contradictions. The last practitioners of the ancient rituals likely never imagined that future generations across the world would one day read about Odin, Thor, Freya, and the Völur in books copied by Christian hands. Yet that is precisely what happened. Memory found a new vessel. The voice became ink. The firelight became parchment. The storyteller survived. Only the medium changed. Still, not everything could be written. Some traditions resist words. The feeling of standing inside an ancient forest before sunrise. The scent of pine smoke drifting through a winter hall. The sound of distant ravens crossing frozen skies. The silence surrounding a burial mound after fresh snowfall. These experiences belong to the senses more than language. No manuscript fully captures them. They must be imagined. Perhaps that is why the old legends continue speaking to modern audiences. They remind us that history was once lived by ordinary people whose hopes, fears, grief, and wonder differed far less from our own than we often assume. The Vikings were not mysterious because they believed strange things. They were human because they searched for meaning in an uncertain world. They faced death without pretending it could be avoided. They honored memory because they understood how quickly memory disappears. They respected nature because survival depended upon it. They created myths because facts alone rarely answer the deepest questions. Were every story true? Certainly not. Some grew larger with every generation. Others blended history with imagination until separating one from the other became impossible. Yet legends need not be literally true to reveal genuine truths about those who created them. Every myth reflects the people who first gathered around the fire to tell it. The rituals of the Vikings were never simply about darkness. They were about uncertainty, about finding courage where certainty did not exist, about accepting that wisdom often begins with acknowledging how little any human being truly knows. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden beneath all the old stories. Not that magic once filled the forests, but that our ancestors looked upon the unknown with enough humility to admit that some mysteries deserved respect rather than easy answers. And if you ever find yourself walking through an ancient woodland as evening quietly settles across the trees, where the wind suddenly falls silent and the last raven disappears beyond the fading light, you may understand, if only for a single moment, why the Vikings believed that the oldest places in the world never truly forget those who pause long enough to listen. The years that followed the coming of Christianity did not erase the old rituals. They concealed them. Across the Scandinavian kingdoms, churches rose where wooden temples had once stood. Kings accepted baptism. New laws discouraged the public sacrifices that had gathered entire communities for centuries. The great blots became memories spoken in quieter voices, while the sacred groves slowly returned to the silence of the forests. To later generations, it appeared as though the old religion had simply vanished. Those who lived through the change knew otherwise. Traditions rooted in memory rarely disappear all at once. They withdraw. They survive inside habits too ordinary to attract attention. An old blessing whispered over a newborn child. A carved rune hidden beneath the beam of a newly built house. A fisherman placing a single silver coin into the sea before launching his boat. No priest witnessed these moments. No chronicler recorded them. Yet they continued, not because people rejected the new faith, but because they struggled to abandon the language through which their ancestors had understood the world. Perhaps nowhere was this struggle more visible than among the last of the Völur. They had once advised kings before battles. They had interpreted dreams that shaped the fate of entire settlements. Their staffs had rested beside the thrones of jarls, and their voices had carried enough authority to silence a crowded hall. Now they found themselves walking roads that fewer travelers recognized. The people still respected them. Many no longer understood them. One legend, preserved only in scattered fragments centuries later, tells of an aging Völva known simply as Astrid of the Pines. Whether she truly existed cannot be proven. Her story survives because it resembles dozens of others told throughout medieval Scandinavia. She lived alone, beyond the edge of cultivated land, where birch forests slowly gave way to ancient pines that had escaped the axes of generations. Travelers occasionally sought her counsel, not because they wished to challenge Christianity, because grief remained unchanged. Fear remained unchanged. The uncertainty of tomorrow remained unchanged. A mother whose child had fallen ill. A sailor preparing for his first voyage across the North Sea. A farmer whose fields had failed after an unusually cold summer. These people did not come seeking miracles. They came seeking understanding. Astrid never claimed to know the future. Instead, she asked questions that unsettled those who visited her. What frightens you more? The storm itself? Or not knowing when it will end? Few expected such answers. Many returned home, thinking more deeply than they had intended. One autumn evening, a young monk arrived at her small wooden cottage. He had heard stories describing her as the last great keeper of forgotten knowledge. Expecting to confront a dangerous pagan sorceress, he instead found an elderly woman repairing a fishing net beside the fire. The cottage contained no golden idols, no hidden altar, no strange symbols painted upon the walls. Only shelves filled with dried herbs, bundles of carefully tied plants hanging from the rafters, clay bowls, wooden cups, simple tools worn smooth by decades of use. The monk hesitated. "This is not what I expected." Astrid smiled. "It rarely is." He remained with her for 3 days. During that time, she spoke almost nothing about gods. Instead, she taught him how certain mosses indicated approaching rain, how ravens often flew lower before winter storms, how the bark of particular trees revealed hidden disease long before the leaves changed color. The monk eventually asked the question that had brought him there. "Were these your rituals?" Astrid looked toward the forest outside her window. They became rituals only after people forgot why they first existed. The answer puzzled him. Seeing his confusion, she continued. "When a hunter thanks the forest after a successful hunt, is he speaking to trees? When a sailor studies the clouds before leaving shore, is he worshiping the sky? No. He is remembering that he is not greater than either." The monk never argued. Years later, according to the legend, he became one of the few Christian writers who described the old traditions with unusual fairness. Whether because of Astrid, or simply because wisdom had softened certainty, no one can say. Stories such as these reveal an important truth about the final generations of the Viking world. The greatest conflict rarely occurred between one religion and another. It unfolded within individual hearts. Many Scandinavians genuinely accepted Christianity. Many also continued carrying emotional connections to landscapes their families had considered sacred for hundreds of years. These loyalties did not always oppose one another. Sometimes they simply coexisted. Archaeology quietly supports this complicated picture. Excavations throughout Scandinavia have uncovered graves dating to this transitional period that combine unmistakably Christian customs with objects rooted in older Norse traditions. A small cross rests beside a Thor's hammer. A Christian burial faces east, yet includes a family heirloom carved with ancient runes. History seldom changes in neat lines. It overlaps. Old beliefs fade slowly enough for children to inherit pieces of both worlds. Among the traditions most resistant to disappearance were those connected to memory itself. Every winter, families continued gathering around great fires after darkness settled across the land. Food remained plentiful when fortune allowed. Stories filled the long nights. The names changed. Kings became saints. Heroes became ancestors. Old gods sometimes became mysterious wanderers whose identities remained deliberately uncertain. Yet the structure of the evening endured. One storyteller spoke. Everyone else listened. This may have been the greatest ritual of all. Not sacrifice, not prophecy, storytelling. A people who preserved their history through spoken words could survive astonishing change as long as someone remembered the tale. The Völur understood this, perhaps better than anyone. Many had ceased performing public ceremonies long before their knowledge disappeared. Instead, they became guardians of memory. Their apprentices no longer memorized complex sacrificial rites. They memorized stories, the tale of Odin hanging upon the world tree, the wisdom hidden within the well of Völur, the courage of Tyr, the coming of Ragnarök. Not because every detail had to be literally true, because stories carried values that facts alone could never preserve. Courage, humility, sacrifice, honor. The old myths became vessels carrying ideas across centuries that no longer welcomed the religion from which those ideas had first emerged. One particularly haunting legend tells of a gathering that occurred during the first winter after a sacred grove had been cut down to build a church. The villagers expected the surviving Völva to protest. She did not. Instead, she attended the church's dedication alongside everyone else. When the ceremony ended and darkness covered the valley, she quietly walked alone to the nearby hillside where the oldest tree stump remained beneath fresh snow. There she lit a single lantern. No prayers, no offerings. She simply remained seated until dawn. A shepherd passing before sunrise asked why she had spent the entire night in the cold. She answered with words that became famous throughout later folklore. A tree falls only once. A memory falls only when no one returns. Whether she mourned the grove, the passing of an age, or simply the people who had once gathered there, the legend never explains. Perhaps all three. The image itself proved unforgettable. An old woman sitting quietly beside a forgotten stump while snow continued falling through the final hours of darkness. As the years became decades, fewer people recognized the significance of such gestures. Children grew into adults without witnessing a single public blot. The old chants vanished. The sacred staffs were buried beside those who had carried them. Entire ceremonies disappeared before anyone thought to write them down. Yet scattered across Scandinavia, certain places retained an unusual reputation. Travelers still avoided particular hills after sunset. Hunters still spoke softly when passing through ancient groves whose original purpose had long been forgotten. Old wells continued receiving small offerings despite no one remembering who had first begun the custom. The rituals themselves had faded. Their echoes remained. And among those echoes, one final mystery continued refusing to disappear. It concerned neither kings nor priests, neither gods nor monsters. It concerned a single object that every Völva carried throughout her life, the iron staff. For long after the last of the old seers had vanished from history, people across the north continued claiming that, on rare autumn mornings when mist drifted low through the forests, a solitary staff could sometimes be found standing upright among the trees, with no footprints leading toward it, and none leading away. No one who claimed to find the staff ever brought it home. Every version of the story ends the same way. The traveler sees it standing silently among the pines, an iron staff darkened by age. Its head worked into delicate curves, unlike the weapons carried by warriors. The forest around it remains perfectly still. No birds sing, no branches sway. For a long moment, the traveler simply watches. Then something changes. Perhaps a gust of wind slips through the trees. Perhaps a raven calls somewhere beyond the mist. Perhaps the traveler merely blinks. When his eyes return to the place where the staff had stood, nothing remains except untouched moss glistening beneath the morning dew. Stories like these spread throughout Scandinavia for centuries. No two versions agreed upon every detail, yet all preserved the same feeling. The old world had not entirely disappeared. It had stepped just beyond the edge of ordinary sight. The iron staff itself held profound meaning within Norse tradition. Archaeologists have uncovered ceremonial staffs in several high-status female graves across Scandinavia. Some were beautifully decorated with bronze fittings. Others carried iron hooks or carefully forged loops, whose exact purpose remains uncertain. Scholars continue debating whether they served practical, symbolic, or ritual functions. Perhaps they fulfilled all three. To later generations, however, the staff became something greater than an archaeological object. It became a symbol of memory, a reminder that wisdom rarely announces itself with noise. The final Völur passed from history without great battles. No saga describes armies marching against them. No king boasts of destroying their order. Instead, they simply grew old, one after another. Like the last leaves clinging to branches after the first winter frost, their apprentices became fewer, their songs shorter, their memories heavier. Eventually, there came a season when no young woman arrived asking to learn the old ways. The chain stretching back through countless generations quietly ended, or so it seemed. One Icelandic manuscript copied during the 13th century preserves a curious tale. Its anonymous author admitted he could not verify its truth. Even so, he chose to record it. He feared that forgetting the story entirely would be a greater mistake than preserving something uncertain. According to the tale, a young shepherd lost several sheep during an unusually dense autumn fog. Searching beyond familiar pastures, he wandered deeper into the forest than anyone from his village normally traveled. Hours passed. The fog thickened until even nearby trees appeared little more than shadows. Then, without warning, the mist opened. Before him lay a clearing unlike any he had ever seen. At its center stood an enormous ash tree, its trunk twisted with age. Its roots rose above the earth before disappearing beneath blankets of emerald moss. Around it rested weathered stones arranged in a perfect circle. None appeared broken. None carried fresh marks. Everything looked impossibly old. The shepherd stepped into the clearing. Immediately, he noticed something strange. The air felt warmer. Not by much. Only enough to feel unmistakably different from the cold forest surrounding it. He called for his missing sheep. No answer came. Instead, he heard another sound. A woman's voice. Not singing, not speaking loudly, simply telling a story. He followed the sound carefully around the ash tree. No one stood there. The clearing remained empty, yet the voice continued. Calm, gentle, steady. He later insisted that he could not understand the language itself. Still, somehow he understood the meaning. It spoke of winter yielding to spring, of rivers flowing toward the sea, of generations replacing one another while the mountains remained. The words themselves faded from memory almost immediately. The feeling never did. Terrified, the shepherd fled. When he finally reached his village, the fog had vanished. His sheep had already returned without him. The villagers searched for the clearing the following day. They found nothing. Only ordinary forest. The oldest woman in the settlement listened carefully before quietly crossing herself. Then she reportedly whispered words no one expected. Leave that place in peace. She never explained how she recognized the story. Perhaps she remembered something her grandmother had once told her beside a winter fire. Perhaps she understood that every land keeps a few secrets for itself. Legends like this reveal an important shift in Scandinavian memory. The Völur gradually ceased becoming historical figures. They became part of folklore. People no longer expected to meet them in neighboring villages. Instead, they belonged to forests, mist, ancient hills. They became guardians of memory rather than participants in daily life. The transformation reflected something larger. History itself had become legend. Centuries passed. Kings rose and fell. The Viking longships disappeared from northern waters. Trade routes changed. Cities expanded. Languages evolved. Yet stories refused to die. During long winters, grandparents still entertained children with tales of Odin wandering the roads, disguised as an old traveler. Hunters still spoke respectfully of ravens watching from the treetops. Fishermen still nodded toward the sea before launching their boats into uncertain waters. Most no longer believed exactly as their ancestors had believed. Still, they remembered. Memory often survives after certainty fades. Modern archaeology has added remarkable depth to these ancient traditions. Each generation uncovers another burial mound, another runestone, another ceremonial site hidden beneath fields cultivated for centuries. Every discovery answers one question while raising several more. A bent sword recovered from a bog, a carved staff buried beside an elderly woman, animal bones arranged with unmistakable care beneath layers of earth. These silent objects cannot tell complete stories, neither can they remain completely silent. Together with the sagas, they reveal fragments of a civilization that viewed the world through symbols as naturally as modern societies view it through written records. The Vikings did not separate history from myth as sharply as we often do today. The deeds of ancestors became legend. Legend shaped identity. Identity influenced action. The cycle continued, generation after generation. Perhaps that is why so many mysteries surrounding the Viking Age remain unsolved. We search for precise answers. The people themselves often valued meaningful stories more than precise explanations. To them, wisdom did not always depend upon certainty. Sometimes it depended upon remembering the right question, and perhaps no question endured longer than this. What becomes of a people when their gods fall silent? The Vikings answered not with despair, but with adaptation. The old religion faded. The values remained. Courage, hospitality, loyalty, respect for nature, acceptance of fate without surrendering hope. These qualities crossed the boundary between religions far more easily than rituals ever could. In that sense, the Viking world never truly disappeared. It changed its clothing. It changed its language. It changed the names by which it understood the sacred. Yet beneath those changes, something older continued, breathing quietly through the forests, across the mountains, and beside the cold northern seas. Perhaps that is why visitors still describe certain Scandinavian landscapes in remarkably similar ways. They speak of unusual silence beneath ancient pines, of burial mounds that inspire unexpected reverence, of mist drifting across forgotten valleys before sunrise. No supernatural explanation is necessary. Such places naturally awaken the imagination. They remind us that the past is never entirely gone. It waits patiently beneath the present, just as old roots continue supporting a tree long after disappearing beneath the earth. The rituals described throughout this journey may no longer be practiced. The fires have burned out. The chants have faded. The sacred groves have become ordinary forests once more. Yet every time an old story is told beside the warmth of a fire on a cold winter evening, something of that ancient world quietly lives again. Not as religion, not as unquestioned truth, but as memory. And memory, perhaps more than any ritual ever performed beneath the northern sky, has always possessed the greatest power of all. By the beginning of the 13th century, the world that had shaped the Vikings existed mostly in memory. The dragon-proud ships no longer ruled the northern seas. The great pagan temples had fallen silent. The Völur, who once traveled between kingdoms, had passed into legend. Yet the north itself had not changed. Winter still arrived with the same relentless certainty. The sea remained just as unforgiving. The forests still swallowed sound beneath their ancient branches. Nature remembered a rhythm older than kingdoms. Perhaps that is why the old stories refused to disappear. Every generation inherited landscapes that seemed to remember more than the people walking through them. A child might never hear the name of Odin spoken inside a church. Still, he would notice that his grandfather always removed his cap before entering a certain grove. A fisherman might recite Christian prayers before sailing, yet he would still pour a few drops of ale into the sea before lifting his sail. He no longer knew exactly why. His father had done the same. His grandfather before him. Sometimes tradition survives long after explanation has vanished. The greatest mysteries often begin that way. One manuscript written in medieval Iceland preserves an unusual conversation between an elderly storyteller and a curious boy. The boy asked whether the old gods had truly existed. The old man remained silent for a long time before answering. "I cannot tell you." The boy frowned. "But you have told these stories your whole life." "I have." "Then surely you know." The old storyteller smiled gently. "I know the stories. That is not the same thing." The distinction puzzled the child. It continues puzzling readers today. The Vikings rarely separated history, legend, memory, and belief as neatly as modern people often try to do. A great king became a hero. A hero became an ancestor. An ancestor slowly entered myth. Generations later, no one could confidently identify where history ended and legend began. Perhaps that uncertainty never troubled them as much as it troubles us. The purpose of a story was not always to preserve every fact. Sometimes it existed to preserve wisdom. This philosophy explains why the old sagas devote as much attention to character as they do to victory. A warrior remembered for keeping his word outlived another, remembered only for killing enemies. An honest ruler earned greater respect than one who simply conquered more land. Honor became a form of immortality, not because it defeated death, because it survived within memory. This belief reached far beyond kings and heroes. Ordinary people sought the same legacy. A skilled shipbuilder hoped future generations would continue sailing vessels crafted according to his methods. A farmer hoped his children would cultivate the same fields with equal care. A mother hoped her stories would still be told after her own voice had fallen silent. The Vikings understood something both simple and profound. Every human life eventually becomes someone else's memory. That realization shaped nearly every ritual they practiced. The sacrifices honored relationships rather than transactions. The burial customs protected remembrance rather than wealth. The runes preserved names against the slow erosion of time. Even the terrifying prophecies surrounding Ragnarök contained an unexpected message. The world itself would one day end. Yet courage remained meaningful because it existed despite that certainty. Modern readers often describe this outlook as tragic. The Vikings might have described it as honest. Several centuries after the Viking Age ended, travelers continued collecting strange tales from remote Scandinavian valleys. One recurring story concerned abandoned longhouses standing far from any occupied settlement. The buildings had collapsed long before. Roofs lay broken. Walls leaned beneath moss and snow. Yet shepherds occasionally claimed they saw lights shining through the empty windows during the longest nights of winter. When they approached, the lights vanished. Inside, they found only silence. Some believed wandering travelers had briefly sheltered there. Others insisted the halls remembered their former inhabitants. Perhaps loneliness itself creates such stories. A ruined home naturally invites imagination. The Vikings knew that abandoned places possess a peculiar power. They encourage people to wonder about the lives once lived there. Who laughed beside those fires? Who celebrated victories? Who mourned the dead? Who whispered prayers before setting sail into uncertain seas? Every empty hall asks the same question. What remains after everyone has gone? The answer, surprisingly, is often story. Archaeologists experience this feeling regularly. A single broken comb, fragments of woven cloth, the iron rivets of a ship buried beneath earth for 1,000 years. None appear remarkable in isolation. Together they reconstruct entire worlds. The smallest object sometimes preserves the greatest mystery. A worn gaming piece suggests laughter after long days of work. A child's toy carved from bone suggests affection surviving even in harsh climates. History rarely speaks through grand monuments alone. It often whispers through ordinary possessions left behind. This is especially true of the Viking Age. Its people built comparatively little in stone. Wood shaped their homes. Wood carried their ships. Wood framed their temples. Time therefore claimed much of what they created. What survives today represents only a fraction of the world they knew. The rest must be imagined. Fortunately, imagination guided by evidence allows forgotten lives to breathe again. Among the most remarkable discoveries ever made in Scandinavia are the preserved bodies recovered from ancient bogs. Some belong to periods long before the Vikings. Others date closer to their age. The cold, oxygen-poor wetlands protected skin, hair, and clothing with astonishing care. Looking upon such faces today feels strangely intimate. The centuries seem to disappear. They no longer resemble distant historical figures. They become people. Someone laughed. Someone feared storms. Someone once looked toward the same northern stars. The Vikings themselves inherited many of these ancient landscapes. They walked past burial mounds already old in their own time. They built farms beside monuments whose builders' names had been forgotten centuries earlier. They understood that history extended far beyond living memory. Perhaps this inspired their remarkable respect for ancestors. No one truly stands alone. Every generation walks roads built by those who came before. Every generation leaves roads for those yet to come. This quiet understanding may explain why so many Viking rituals focused less upon individual salvation and more upon continuity. The community mattered. The family mattered. The land mattered. A single life found meaning through connection with something enduring. As the old religion faded into folklore, these values proved far more resilient than any ceremony. The rituals changed. The principles endured. That endurance itself became the final victory of the Viking spirit. Not conquest, not empire, memory. There is an old Scandinavian saying recorded centuries after the Viking Age. It claims that snow eventually covers every footprint. No traveler can prevent that. The wise traveler simply leaves behind a path worth remembering. Whether the saying truly originated among the Vikings cannot be known. It certainly reflects their understanding of life. Nothing escapes time. Not kings, not temples, not even gods. Only the stories continue walking after the footsteps have vanished. And as another long northern winter settled across the forests where sacred groves had once stood, an elderly storyteller would lift his eyes toward the firelight, wait until the room grew perfectly still, and begin once again with the same words his grandfather had spoken before him, ensuring that the oldest rituals of all, the rituals of memory and storytelling, would outlive every kingdom that had ever risen beneath the cold skies of the north. Every story, no matter how vast, eventually reaches the place where the fire burns low. The voices become quieter. The night grows deeper. The listener begins to understand that the journey was never only about the destination. It was about everything discovered along the way. Over the course of this journey, we have wandered through sacred groves where no axe dared strike an ancient tree. We have stood beside great halls where winter sacrifices united entire communities beneath smoke-darkened roofs. We have followed the Völur into silent forests where wisdom was sought not through certainty, but through patience. We have watched berserkers prepare themselves for battle, believing courage required the surrender of fear rather than the absence of it. We have listened to stories of Odin's sacrifice, of runes carved into wood and stone, of ravens circling above lonely hills, and of the quiet acceptance that even the gods themselves could not escape fate. Taken separately, each ritual may seem mysterious. Together, they reveal something remarkably familiar. The Vikings were not obsessed with darkness. They were obsessed with understanding a world that often refused to explain itself. Their winters were long. Their seas were dangerous. Harvests sometimes failed without warning. Storms could erase an entire family in a single afternoon. No amount of strength could command the wind. No king could bargain with winter. Faced with such uncertainty, they created rituals that offered structure, where nature offered none. They gathered together. They remembered their ancestors. They shared food. They honored promises. They accepted sacrifice as part of life, rather than an interruption to it. To modern eyes, some of these traditions appear harsh. Some seem unsettling. Others are almost certainly exaggerated by centuries of storytelling, misunderstanding, and religious conflict. Yet beneath every legendary embellishment rests an unmistakably human foundation. People searching for hope. People trying to protect those they loved. People asking questions that every generation continues asking. How should we face death? What do we owe those who came before us? Can wisdom ever be earned without sacrifice? What remains after we are gone? Archaeology gives us fragments. The sagas give us voices. The landscapes of Scandinavia give us atmosphere. None provides every answer. Perhaps they were never meant to. History is not a perfectly completed puzzle waiting for the final missing piece. It is more like the northern sky itself. On a clear night, thousands of stars become visible. Some shine brilliantly. Others barely appear. Darkness exists between them. Yet together, they form a picture greater than any single point of light. The Viking world survives in much the same way. A burial mound rising gently above an open field. A weathered runestone standing beside an old road. The remains of a longship resting beneath centuries of earth. A line of poetry copied by a medieval monk. A legend whispered beside a fire while snow gathers beyond the windows. Each is only one small light. Together, they illuminate an entire civilization. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to endure after more than 1,000 years. Not because every tale is historically perfect. Not because every legend is literally true. But because they remind us that every civilization, no matter how distant, was built by ordinary people confronting extraordinary uncertainty. The Vikings laughed. They mourned. They celebrated births. They buried loved ones. They worried about failed harvests. They dreamed of distant horizons. They feared what waited beyond death. In the end, they were not so different from us. The rituals changed. The kingdoms disappeared. The longships rotted into the soil. The old gods slowly became characters within stories. Yet courage remained. Curiosity remained. The desire to understand the unknown remained. Those things belong to every age. If there is one final lesson hidden beneath all the legends of the Viking Age, perhaps it is this. A civilization is remembered not only for the battles it wins or the monuments it builds. It is remembered for the stories it chooses to preserve. The Vikings understood that better than most. Long before books filled libraries, they carried history inside memory. They passed wisdom from one voice to another until entire generations became living libraries. Had they failed to tell those stories, almost nothing of their world would have survived. Tonight, more than 1,000 years later, their voices still reach across time. Not through magic, not through prophecy, but through storytelling. And perhaps that has always been the greatest ritual of all. One storyteller, one fire, one listener willing to imagine a world long vanished beyond the horizon. As our fire finally burns low and the last embers settle into glowing ash, the forests grow quiet once more. The ravens return to their ancient branches. The sea continues its endless conversation with the northern shore. Somewhere beneath the moss, forgotten runes still sleep beside roots older than kingdoms. Whether they still hold secrets is something history may never fully answer. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, not because they cannot be solved, but because they remind us that wonder still has a place in the world. And perhaps, if you ever find yourself standing alone beneath towering pines on a cold autumn evening, when the wind suddenly falls silent and the fading light turns the forest into a sea of shadows, you may understand why the people of the North believed that every ancient place carries an echo of those who once walked there. Not waiting to be feared, simply waiting to be remembered. Thank you for spending this evening exploring the forgotten world of the dark rituals of the Vikings with us. From all of us here at Forbidden Lore, thank you for joining this journey through history, legend, and myth. If you enjoyed tonight's story, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us continue bringing the forgotten stories of the ancient world back to life. Let us know in the comments which civilization or legend you would like to explore next. Until our next journey into the shadows of history, keep your curiosity alive, keep your fire burning, and remember that every legend begins with someone willing to listen. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams carry you safely across calm seas, beneath a sky filled with quiet northern stars.